Come back, please. I am in the darkness without you, not the kind I can navigate.
3 days. She had been gone for 3 days, and the silence in the room had become a living thing. A presence that pressed against his chest and filled his lungs and made every breath feel like drowning. He stood by the fireplace, with his hand on the mantel, and his useless eyes burning, and he said to no one, to the dark, to the woman who was not there, "Come back, please. I am in the dark without you, not the kind I can navigate." She was the only person who had ever spoken to him without a single word, and he had lost her. "Hello, my friend. Come in. Get comfortable. I have a story for you tonight that I think you're going to carry with you for a while. This is Aristocratic Hearts, a place where we explore love in all its complicated, devastating, beautiful forms. I'm so happy you're here. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from. Are you winding down after a long day? Just waking up? Somewhere in between? Drop your city and your time zone in the comments. I read every single one. Tonight's story is different from anything I've told you before. It's about a woman who lost her voice, not by choice, not by illness, but by trauma. A fire stole it from her when she was 11 years old, and the world decided that a girl who could not speak was a girl who did not matter. For 11 years she has lived in silence, invisible to everyone around her, overlooked, pitied, dismissed. And it's about a man who lost his sight. A duke, no less, one of the most powerful men in England, who went blind 3 years ago and has since locked himself away from the world, refusing every visitor, every invitation, every attempt to draw him back into society. A man whom London whispers about but no longer sees. What happens when two people who have been erased by the world find each other? When the only man who cannot see her is the first person who truly does? I poured everything into this one, and I think you'll feel it. Now, let me take you back to the spring of 1849, to a world of candle-lit ballrooms and whispered secrets, where a young seamstress named Georgiana Lyle was about to have the quietest, most world-altering day of her life. The shop stood on the corner of Barlow Street and St. Martin's Lane, a narrow establishment wedged between a bookseller and a tobacconist, its front window perpetually cluttered with bolts of fabric in varying states of arrangement. The painted sign above the door read, "Madame Delacroix, Modiste," though there was no Madame Delacroix and never had been. The shop belonged to Mrs. Agatha Holt, a stout Yorkshire woman who had determined upon opening her establishment 14 years ago that a French name would attract a better class of customer. She had been correct. The lie had served her well. Georgiana Lyle worked at the table in the back room, where the light was worst and the air smelled of sizing and tallow. She had worked there for 6 years, since she was 16, since Mrs. Holt had taken pity on a mute girl with fast hands and no prospects, and offered her a position that paid 12 shillings a week. It was not generous. It was not meant to be. But it was steady. And for a girl who could not speak in a city that valued speech above almost everything else, steady was the closest thing to safety she had ever known. She was 22 years old. Her hair was the colour of dark honey, always pinned back, always escaping in fine wisps around her temples, despite her best efforts. Her eyes were brown. Not the fashionable kind, not the sort that poets compared to chocolate or autumn leaves, but the quiet, watchful brown of a creature that has learned to observe because it cannot participate. She was not beautiful in the way that London understood beauty. She was too thin, her hands too roughened by needlework, her expression too still, too contained. But there was something in her face, in the way her gaze settled on things and stayed there, patient and complete, that occasionally made people look twice. They rarely looked a third time. By then they had noticed the silence, and the silence made them uncomfortable, and they turned away. This was the rhythm of Georgiana's life. She arrived at the shop at 7 each morning. She sewed. She fitted. She pinned. She altered. She communicated through gestures, through nods, through the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, its pages filled with her neat, careful handwriting, measurements, notes, the occasional necessary sentence. "Yes, madam. The hem will be ready Thursday. Shall I take it in at the waist?" She went home at 8 each evening to the single room she rented above a chandler's shop on Drury Lane, where she ate bread and cheese by candlelight and read whatever book she had borrowed from the circulating library that week. And then she slept, and then she woke, and then she did it all again. It was not a life, it was an existence. And she had long since stopped expecting it to become anything else. Now, it's important to understand something about Georgiana's world, about what it meant to be a woman without a voice in 1849 England. We think of muteness as a physical condition, and it is. But in this era, it was also a social one. A woman's value in society was measured by her ability to converse, to charm, to navigate the elaborate verbal dances of courtship and commerce. A woman who could not speak was, in the eyes of the law and of polite society, something close to invisible. She could not testify in court. She could not negotiate her own wages effectively. She could not defend herself against slander because she could not speak to deny it. When Georgiana walked through the streets of London, people stepped around her the way they stepped around lampposts, acknowledging her presence just enough to avoid collision, but never enough to see her as a person. This was not cruelty exactly. It was something worse. It was indifference. The day that changed everything began with a delivery. Mrs. Holt emerged from the front of the shop at 9:30, her face arranged in the particular expression she wore when money was involved, a careful blend of deference and calculation. "Georgiana." She spoke slowly and clearly, the way she always did, as though Georgiana's muteness extended to her ears. It did not. Georgiana heard everything. She simply could not answer. "We have a commission, a significant one, from the household of the Duke of Waverly." Georgiana's needle paused. She knew the name. Everyone in London knew the name. Theodore Ashby, the 6th Duke of Waverly, was the subject of more drawing-room speculation than any man in England, and he had not been seen in public for 3 years. The story was well known, had been chewed over and embellished and picked apart by every gossip in London until the truth and the legend were hopelessly entangled. 3 years ago, the Duke of Waverly had been thrown from his horse during a hunt at his country estate. The fall had not killed him, but the blow to his head had taken his sight, slowly at first and then completely over the course of 6 weeks. By the time the finest doctors in London had been summoned, examined him, consulted with each other, and delivered their verdict, the Duke was entirely blind. He had been 30 years old, unmarried, wealthy beyond comprehension. £42,000 a year, 3 estates, a seat in the House of Lords, and a reputation for being the most private man in the aristocracy even before his accident. After it, he had simply vanished, dismissed his valet, refused visitors, retreated to his London townhouse on Grosvenor Square and drawn the curtains, and London had not seen him since. There were rumours, naturally, that he had gone mad, that he raged through the empty rooms, smashing furniture, that he sat in darkness. Though what difference darkness made to a blind man the gossips never quite explained, and refused to eat. That his man of business managed everything. That his mother, Lady Ashby, visited once a month and wept in the carriage afterward. That he was dying. That he was already dead and the household was concealing it to maintain access to his accounts. None of these rumours were entirely true. None of them were entirely false. "His housekeeper has sent word," Mrs. Holt continued, consulting a letter in her hand. "The Duke requires new shirts, 12, and this is the peculiar part, and they must be fitted in person, at his residence. Apparently the Duke's previous tailor retired, and he is particular about the cut." She looked at Georgiana with an expression that was half apology, half command. "I need you to go. I cannot leave the shop, and the commission is worth £8. Georgiana stared at her. £8 was more than she earned in 3 months. Mrs. Holt seemed to read the question in her eyes. "Yes, I know. A seamstress, not a tailor. But we do gentlemen's alterations regularly, and your stitching is finer than any tailor's on Jermyn Street. Besides—" She hesitated, then said what she was really thinking. "The housekeeper specified discretion. Someone quiet. Someone who would not talk about what she saw." There it was. The reason Georgiana had been chosen was not her skill, though her skill was considerable. It was her silence. The Duke wanted someone who could not gossip about his condition, his household, his private humiliation, and who better than a woman who could not speak at all? The knowledge settled in Georgiana's chest like a stone. She was useful precisely because she was broken. She nodded. Mrs. Holt handed her the letter with the address and the time, 2 o'clock that afternoon, and turned back to the front of the shop. At the doorway she paused. "Georgiana, don't embarrass me." Georgiana's hands were steady as she packed her tools, her measuring tape, her pins, her chalk, her shears, her notebook. But something inside her was not steady at all. Something inside her was vibrating with a frequency she did not recognize. Because she had not felt it in so long she had forgotten its name. It was anticipation. The Duke of Waverly's London residence occupied the northeast corner of Grosvenor Square, a vast Portland stone edifice that radiated wealth and silence in equal measure. Georgiana stood before the servants' entrance at precisely 2 o'clock, her tool case in one hand and her notebook in the other, and waited while a footman with a face like a closed door examined her as though she were a parcel he had not ordered. "The seamstress?" he said. She nodded. "This way." The interior of the house was darker than she had expected. The curtains were drawn in every room they passed through, and the few candles that burned did so with a kind of reluctant obligation, as though the house itself resented the need for light. The furniture was fine, she could see that much, but everything had been rearranged. Tables pushed against walls, chairs in precise positions, rugs removed to reveal bare floorboards. The house had been stripped of anything a blind man might trip over, and the result was a space that felt both vast and claustrophobic, like a cathedral emptied of its pews. The footman led her to a room on the first floor, a study, or what had once been a study. Books still lined the walls, though no one read them now. A fire burned in the grate, casting uneven light across a writing desk that held nothing but a glass of water and a pair of gloves. And in the chair beside the window with its heavy curtains drawn against the April afternoon, sat a man. Georgiana stopped. She had seen portraits of the Duke of Waverly. Everyone had. Before his accident, he had been considered one of the handsomest men in London, dark-haired, sharp-featured, with the cunning kind of austere elegance that made women stare and men feel inadequate. The portraits had shown confidence, authority, the easy command of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. The man in the chair was recognizably the same person, and yet entirely different. His hair was still dark, but longer now, curling slightly past his collar in a way that suggested he no longer cared how it looked. His jaw was sharper, his cheekbones more pronounced. He had lost weight, she thought. His clothes were impeccable because his servants dressed him, but there was something about the way he sat. Perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, his grey eyes open but focused on nothing. that made her breath catch. He was not ruined. He was not mad. He was simply gone, retreated to some interior place where the loss of the external world could not reach him. "Your Grace," the footman said, "the seamstress has arrived." The Duke did not turn his head. "Leave us." "Your Grace, I said leave us." The footman withdrew. The door closed, and Georgiana stood alone in a darkened room with a blind Duke and the sudden, terrifying realization that she had no way to announce herself. She could not say, "I am here." She could not say, "Good afternoon, Your Grace." She could not say anything at all. She stood perfectly still, and she waited. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the fire and the distant clatter of a carriage on the square outside. Then the Duke spoke. "You're still here?" She blinked. She had made no sound. How did he— "I can hear you breathing," he said. His voice was low, measured, stripped of all social performance. "And I can smell lavender. You keep it in your pockets, or perhaps in your tool case. Am I wrong?" She stared at him. She did keep dried lavender in her tool case, a sachet, to keep the fabric fresh. No one had ever noticed. "You may speak," he said. There was the faintest edge of impatience in his tone, the impatience of a man who had grown accustomed to silence and now found it inconvenient from others. She could not speak. That was the entire point of her being here, and no one had told him. The silence stretched. His head tilted further, like a hunting bird recalibrating. "Are you deaf?" he asked. Not unkindly. Simply directly, in the manner of a man who had lost patience with euphemisms years ago. She stepped forward, one step, deliberate, her boot striking the bare floorboard. His head tracked the sound instantly, precisely, the way a compass needle finds north. Another step. She reached the writing desk, set down her tool case. The clasp clicked as she opened it. Then she pulled out her notebook and pencil and wrote quickly, tore out the page and placed it in his hand. His fingers closed around the paper. And then his expression shifted, not dramatically, not the way faces change in stories, but subtly, a small contraction of something behind his eyes. "I cannot read this," he said quietly. "I cannot see it." Of course. She had known that. She had known it, and she had done it anyway because the notebook was her only language and she had no other way to reach him. And in that moment she felt the full, crushing weight of her limitation in a way she had not felt since she was 11 years old, standing in the smoking ruins of her father's shop, screaming without sound. She stood there. He sat there. Two people trapped on opposite sides of a wall that neither of them had built. And then, slowly, carefully, she reached out and took his hand. He went rigid, every muscle in his body seized, and she felt the tension in his fingers like a current, like touching a wire drawn too tight. No one touched the Duke of Waverly. She understood that instinctively, the way she understood fabric and thread and the architecture of a well-made seam. No one touched him because he could not see it coming, and the surprise of contact was something he had not learned to tolerate. But she did not let go. Instead, with the index finger of her right hand, she traced a letter on his palm. Then another. Then another. Georgiana. His breathing changed. She could hear it, the sharp intake, the held pause, the slow release. His fingers, which had been rigid, gradually uncurled. He did not pull away. She traced again. This time, CANNOTSPEAK. For a long time he said nothing. His hand remained open, palm up, as though waiting for more, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed. The impatience was gone. In its place was something she could not name, something raw and close to the surface, like a wound that had been covered for so long that the act of uncovering it was itself a kind of pain. They sent me a woman who cannot speak, he said. It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was, and this was the thing that undid her, almost a laugh, almost wonder. Of course they did. He turned his hand over, and his fingers found hers, and he held them for exactly 3 seconds before releasing them with the careful precision of a man who understood that he had just done something he could not take back. "Well then, Georgiana who cannot speak," he said, "I suppose we shall have to find another way. I have to pause here and tell you, when I first wrote this scene, I sat with it for a long time. There's something about two people meeting at the exact intersection of their limitations, her silence and his darkness. That struck me as one of the most honest depictions of connection I've ever tried to capture. Because that's what real intimacy is, isn't it? Not two perfect people finding each other, but two broken people discovering that their broken edges fit together in ways no one else's could. But back to the story. The fitting that followed was unlike anything Georgiana had ever experienced. In the shops and drawing rooms where she normally worked, her clients spoke at her. A constant stream of preferences, complaints, instructions, opinions about fabric and cut and fashion that she was expected to absorb and execute. They spoke because they could, and because her silence created a vacuum that people instinctively rushed to fill. The Duke did not fill it. He sat in his chair, still as marble, while she took his measurements, and because he could not see her gestures and she could not speak her findings, they developed, in those first minutes, without discussion, without agreement, a system. She would touch his shoulder, and he would stand. Touch his arm, and he would raise it. A tap on his wrist meant she needed to measure his cuff. A gentle pressure on his back meant turn. It was clumsy at first, halting. Her touches too tentative, his responses too sharp, both of them navigating the profound intimacy of physical contact between strangers. But by the time she was measuring the breadth of his shoulders, something had shifted. His muscles had relaxed beneath her. Hands. Her fingers had steadied. They were communicating, she realized, not in words, not in letters traced on palms, in something older than either. The language of touch itself. When she needed to record a measurement, she took his hand again and traced the numbers on his palm. He repeated them aloud. 16¼ inches. And she nodded before remembering that he could not see her nod, and so she tapped his palm twice for yes. Once for no. Twice for yes. He learned it immediately. She had not asked him to. He simply absorbed it, the way a man of considerable intelligence absorbs any new system placed before him. And within 10 minutes, he was responding to her taps and touches as naturally as if they had been doing this for years. "You're very good at this," he said, as she was measuring his wrist. It was not flattery. He said it the way he might have observed that the weather had changed. As a simple statement of fact, she tapped his palm once. "No." "No?" A flicker of something crossed his face. Amusement, perhaps, or curiosity. "You disagree?" She traced on his palm. OTHERSHAVETAILORS. "Others have tailors," he repeated, "and I have a mute seamstress because my housekeeper decided that what I needed most was discretion." His mouth curved. Not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one she suspected he had produced in months. She was wrong, as it happens. What I needed most was someone who wouldn't spend the entire appointment telling me how sorry they were about my condition. Georgiana's hands paused on the measuring tape. She traced AREYOUSORRYABOUTMINE. The pause that followed was different from the others. It was not the pause of a man formulating a response. It was the pause of a man who had been struck by something unexpected, a blade slipping through armor he had thought was solid. "No," he said, "I am not sorry about yours. You seem to manage rather well without it." She traced SODOYOU, and this time he did smile. Brief. Barely there, gone almost before it arrived. But Georgiana saw it. She, who had spent 11 years watching faces because she could not participate in conversations, and she catalogued it the way she catalogued everything, precisely, completely, and with a depth of attention that most people never gave to anything. It was the first genuine smile, she suspected, that the Duke of Waverly had produced in 3 years. The shirts took a week to complete. Georgiana worked on them at Mrs. Holt's shop during the day, and in her room at night, stitching by candlelight until her fingers ached and her eyes burned. She used the finest cotton, better than Mrs. Holt had authorized, the difference coming from Georgiana's own wages, and she sewed each one with a care that went beyond professionalism. Into each collar she worked a tiny, nearly invisible mark, a single stitch in silk thread, placed where it would rest, against the back of his neck. He would feel it, she knew. He felt everything. It was, she told herself, merely a craftsman's signature. Nothing more. When she returned to Grosvenor Square the following week with the completed shirts, the same closed-faced footman led her to the same darkened study. The Duke was standing this time near the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel. He turned his head when she entered. "Lavender," he said, "and sizing. And something else. Tallow. You've been working by candlelight." She stopped. He had identified her by smell alone, and not merely identified her. He had read her weak from the scents on her skin and clothes. She had been working late. Tallow candles, not beeswax, because she could not afford beeswax. He knew. She crossed the room and placed the shirts in his hands. He ran his fingers over the fabric slowly, methodically, the way she imagined he now explored everything, through touch, through texture, through the information his remaining senses could gather. His fingertips found the seams, tested the stitching, traced the collar, and stopped. His thumb moved back and forth over the tiny silk stitch she had placed there. Once, twice, 3 times. "What is this?" he asked. She took his other hand and traced M-Y-M-A-R-K. "Your mark," he repeated. His thumb continued to move over the stitch, as though memorizing its texture. "So I'll know which shirts are yours?" She tapped twice. "Yes." He said nothing for a long time. His face did nothing for a long time. But his thumb did not stop moving over that small, secret mark, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with disuse. "I want you to come back," he said. "Not for shirts. There are other things that need mending." There were not other things that needed mending. They both knew it. But Georgiana tapped his palm twice, and the arrangement was made. "Now, I need to tell you something about the Duke of Waverly's blindness, because it matters to understand what Georgiana was walking into. In 1849, blindness was not merely a medical condition, it was a social catastrophe. For a man of the Duke's standing, the loss of sight meant the loss of virtually everything that defined his position in the world. He could not read his own correspondence. He could not review his accounts. He could not ride. He could not attend Parliament effectively. He could not recognize the faces of the people around him, which meant he could not navigate the intricate social hierarchies that governed aristocratic life. In a world where power was performed, where a man demonstrated his authority through his gaze, his bearing, his visible command of every room he entered, a blind duke was, in the eyes of society, barely a duke at all. The legal implications were equally devastating. While a blind peer retained his title and his seat in the House of Lords, his ability to manage his own affairs was constantly questioned. There had been whispered conversations, Georgiana would learn of these later, about whether the Duke's man of business should be granted power of attorney, about whether the Duke was competent to make decisions regarding his estates. about whether, in short, a blind man could truly be trusted with £42,000 a year and the welfare of 300 tenants. The Duke knew about these conversations. He heard everything, the way Georgiana saw everything, and his response had been the same as hers, withdrawal. If the world would not accept him as he was, he would give the world nothing at all. It was this shared exile, this mutual retreat from a society that could not accommodate what they were, that made their connection not just natural, but inevitable. She came back 3 days later, and 3 days after that, and 3 days after that. The pretense of mending lasted approximately 2 visits. By the third, Georgiana was sitting in the study while the Duke stood by the fireplace, and they were simply present, together, in a room where neither of them had to perform the version of themselves that the world demanded. Their communication evolved rapidly. The palm tracing was too slow for real conversation, and they both knew it. So they began to build something else, a system that grew organically, the way languages always grow, from necessity and repetition and the deep human need to be understood. It started with the taps, 1 for no, 2 for yes. That had been established on the first day. But Georgiana added to it. 3 taps on his wrist meant wait. A squeeze of his fingers meant I understand. A touch to his elbow meant come with me. She developed a way of drumming her fingertips against his palm in specific patterns, short taps and long presses, like a kind of physical Morse code, though she had never heard of Morse code and wouldn't have cared if she had. Each pattern meant a word, a sentence, an idea. He learned them all, not just learned them, expanded them. He began creating his own patterns. A specific sequence drummed against the back of her hand meant tell me more. Another meant I disagree. A third, and this one made her pulse quicken every time she felt it, simply meant stay. We're building a language, he said one afternoon, with that almost smile that she had now seen 4 times and counted each one. You realize that? She traced on his palm. O-U-R-S. Ours, he repeated. Yes, I suppose it is. The word settled between them like a physical thing, warm and weighted with implication neither of them was ready to examine. By the third visit they could hold entire conversations through touch alone. He would ask a question aloud. Because his voice still worked, still carried the authority and precision of a man who had been educated at Eton and Oxford and had commanded rooms full of powerful men. And she would answer, through their system, quick exchanges, the tapping and touching flowing as naturally as speech. But it was more than speech. That was the thing Georgiana understood before he did, because she had spent 11 years watching the inadequacy of words. People lied with words, they deflected, they performed, they said, I'm well when they were dying, and how lovely to see you, to people they despised, and I love you without meaning a single syllable of it. You could not lie through touch. The body betrayed what the mouth concealed. When she was nervous, her fingertips trembled against his palm, and he felt it. When he was in pain, the headaches came sometimes, remnants of the injury. His hand would tighten around hers involuntarily, and she felt that too. Their language stripped away every layer of social pretense and left only the raw, unguarded truth of what they were feeling in each exact moment. It was the most honest communication either of them had ever experienced, and it was terrifying. On the 4th visit, he took her to the music room. It was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a corridor she had not yet explored, a room that smelled of dust and disuse, and the faint, lingering ghost of polish on fine wood. A grand piano stood in the centre, its lid closed, its surface dulled by 3 years of neglect. The Duke had not played since the accident. His fingers still knew the keys. The body remembers what the mind decides to forget. But playing music he could not share had felt like one cruelty too many. And so the piano had stood silent, as closed and abandoned as everything else in the house. He led her to it by touch, her hand in the crook of his arm. When they reached the piano, he lifted the lid and stood there for a moment, his hands hovering over the keys, with the particular hesitation of a man who has not spoken in a long time and is afraid of what his voice will sound like. "I haven't played in 3 years," he said. "It may be appalling." She tapped his arm twice. She didn't care. He sat. He placed his fingers on the keys. And then he played. It was not appalling. It was the sound of a man unlocking a door he had sealed shut 3 years ago. The first notes were hesitant, uncertain. The muscle memory was there, but the confidence was not, and the melody stumbled in places, paused in others, the way speech stumbles and pauses when someone is saying something difficult for the first time. But the music found its footing. His fingers remembered. And within a minute, the room was full. Full of sound, full of resonance, full of the particular quality of a grand piano, played by someone who had once been very good, and who was discovering with each passing bar that he still was. Georgiana could not hear the music the way others heard it. The melody was muted for her. She could perceive sound, but without the richness and clarity that hearing people took for granted. What she could do, what she had discovered years ago, alone in her room, pressing her hand against the wall while the chandler below played his fiddle, was feel it. She placed her hands on the piano. The vibrations travelled through the polished wood and into her palms and up her arms and into her chest, and she felt the music the way the Duke felt her words on his palm, not through the intended sense, but through a deeper one. The bass notes were warm and heavy, settling in her bones. The treble was lighter, sharper, a flutter against her fingertips like the wings of something small and alive. And the spaces between the notes, the pauses, the silences were not empty at all. They were full of intention, full of meaning, full of the same deliberate, communicative silence that she had spent her life inhabiting. He was speaking to her through the piano. She understood this with the certainty of a woman who had spent 11 years reading the world through every sense except her voice. He was saying things he could not say aloud. About the darkness, about the fear, about the loneliness of 3 years in a silent house, and about the way all of it had begun to lift since the afternoon she had traced her name on his palm. She moved closer. She sat beside him on the bench, her hip against his, her hands still on the piano's body, and she felt the music change. The melody softened, warmed, became something that was not a performance but a conversation, the piano singing to her the way he could not sing, the notes finding her through wood and bone, and the misty, mysterious alchemy of vibration. When he finished, the silence was different from the silence before. Fuller, more complete, the silence of a room where something has been said that cannot be unsaid. "Could you feel it?" he asked. He was not asking about the vibrations. He was asking about what was underneath them. She took his hand and pressed it to her chest, over her heart, which was beating in a rhythm that had nothing to do with exercise or fear. 2 taps. Yes. He exhaled. "Good," he said. And then, "I'm going to play for you every time you come, because the piano can say things that I cannot, and because I want you to feel something beautiful. I want to be the one who gives you that." She leaned her head against his shoulder. It was the first time she had offered not just her hands but her weight, the full, trusting weight of her body against his. And he went absolutely still beneath her, and then he turned his face into her hair and breathed in lavender and sizing and tallow and Georgiana, and neither of them moved for a very long time. The 5th visit was when it changed. She had arrived at her usual time, 2 o'clock. and the footman had led her to the study as always. But today, the Duke was not by the fireplace. He was sitting at the writing desk, and before him was a sheet of paper, and beside the paper was a pot of ink and a pen. "I want you to teach me to write to you," he said, without preamble. "I can form letters. My hand remembers. But I need to know." He paused. "I need to know what you would say, if you could." Georgiana stood in the doorway, and something cracked open inside her chest, something that had been sealed for 11 years, sealed so tightly she had forgotten it was there. Because no one had ever asked her that. Not once in 11 years had anyone said, "What would you say?" They had said, "Can you nod? Can you write it down? Can you point?" They had asked her to communicate in their language, on their terms, through their systems. No one had ever tried to enter hers. She crossed the room. She sat in the chair beside him. She took his hand, and for the first time she did not trace letters. She pressed his fingers against her throat. He went completely still. His fingertips rested against the column of her neck, against the scar tissue there, the burns from the fire, usually hidden by her high collars, the marks that had damaged her vocal cords beyond repair. She felt his fingers register the texture of the scars, felt them stop, felt the almost imperceptible increase in pressure that meant he was paying absolute attention. And then she did something she had not done in years. She tried to speak. No sound came. It never did. But the muscles of her throat moved beneath his fingers, the intent to speak, the shape of words forming in a voice that could not carry them. He felt every movement, every almost word, every ghost of language vibrating against his skin. "Again?" he whispered. His fingers pressed closer. "Do that again." She shaped the word that was in her heart, the one she would have said if she could have said anything at all. Her throat moved, his fingers read it, and his face, his beautiful, sharp, closed face, broke open. "Georgiana," he said. Her name in his voice, which had gone rough and raw and stripped of every defense he had spent 3 years building. "I felt that. I felt you say..." She pressed her fingers to his lips. Not to silence him. He didn't need silencing. But because she wanted to feel his mouth shape her name the way he had felt her throat shape whatever word she had tried to give him. They sat like that for a long time, his fingers on her throat, her fingers on his lips, two people speaking to each other in a language that had no sound and needed none. "I have to tell you something," he said finally. His voice was barely above a whisper, and she felt the vibration of it against her fingertips. "I have not left this house in 3 years. I have not touched another person willingly in 3 years. I have not wanted to. Do you understand what I am telling you?" She tapped his wrist twice. "Yes. I am telling you that whatever this is, whatever we are building, it is the only thing in my life that feels real. And I need you to know that before it goes any further. Because it will go further. I can already feel that it will." She took his hand and traced, slowly, deliberately, I-K-N-O-W. Then I-A-M-N-O-T-A-F-R-A-I-D. His breath shuddered out of him, a sound she had never heard him make, a sound of something clenched, finally releasing. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his chest, over his heart, where she could feel the rapid, almost violent beating of it beneath her palm. "I am," he said. "I am afraid, but not of you, never of you." The world outside the study on Grosvenor Square continued without them. London turned. The season approached, and in a drawing-room in Belgravia, Lady Prudence Hathaway was very displeased. Lady Hathaway was 53 years old, the widow of Sir Reginald Hathaway, and the undisputed sovereign of the social sphere that orbited the fringes of the true aristocracy. She was not noble herself. Her title was merely a courtesy, her husband having been a baronet. But she had spent 30 years cultivating relationships with women who were, and she wielded that network like a weapon. There was not a drawing room in Mayfair that she could not influence, not a guest list she could not alter, not a reputation she could not destroy with a well-placed word over tea. She had a daughter, Miss Lydia Hathaway, 20 years old, blonde, accomplished, and equipped with a dowry of £8,000 that Lady Hathaway had assembled through a combination of careful investment and ruthless social manoeuvring. Lydia was pretty. Lydia played the pianoforte. Lydia could converse in French and Italian and had been trained since birth to be the perfect wife for a man of significant rank. And Lady Hathaway had decided 3 years ago, in fact, the moment the Duke of Waverly lost his sight, that Lydia would be the Duchess of Waverly. The reasoning was cold and brilliant. A blind duke was a vulnerable duke. A duke who could not see would need a wife to manage his household, to be his eyes in society, to stand beside him and interpret the world he could no longer navigate. Such a wife would wield extraordinary power, not just as a duchess, but as the functional head of one of the greatest houses in England. And a wife from a background like Lydia's, respectable but not noble, could be presented as a compassionate choice, a love match, a story that would make the Duke sympathetic and his new Duchess admired. Lady Hathaway had spent 3 years laying the groundwork. She had cultivated the Duke's mother, Lady Ashby, sending gifts and condolences and carefully worded letters expressing her concern for the Duke's welfare. She had ensured that Lydia's name was mentioned in every conversation about suitable brides for the Duke. She had planted the seeds so thoroughly that half of London assumed the match was already being arranged. And then she had learned, through a network of informants that would have impressed the Foreign Office, that a seamstress had been visiting the Duke's house 3 times a week for the past month. A seamstress. A nobody. A mute nobody. Lady Hathaway did not raise her voice when she received this intelligence. She did not need to. She simply set down her teacup with a precision that made the bone china ring against the saucer like a bell and said to the room at large, "I see." Those 2 words contained more menace than most people could pack into a speech. She began with the mother. Lady Anne Lyle, Georgiana's mother, lived in 2 rooms above a greengrocer's shop in Cheapside, a considerable step down from the modest but respectable house on Bishopsgate, where Georgiana had spent her first 11 years. The fire that killed her husband and scarred her daughter had also destroyed the shop, the inventory, and their home. The insurance had paid a fraction of the loss. Anne Lyle had survived on a widow's pension of £30 a year, and the quiet, corrosive bitterness of a woman who had once been comfortable and was now merely enduring. She had not forgiven Georgiana for the fire. This was neither fair nor rational. Georgiana had been 11 years old, asleep in her bed when the workshop below caught fire, and had nearly died herself. But grief and poverty do not produce fairness or rationality. They produce blame. And Anne Lyle had fixed her blame on her daughter with the tenacity of a woman who needed someone to be responsible for the ruin of her life. "If you had woken your father," she had said more than once in the early years, "if you had smelled the smoke sooner, if you had not been so deeply asleep." She did not say, "if you had died instead of him." She did not need to. It was there in the silences between her words, in the way she looked at Georgiana's scarred throat, in the way she flinched when her daughter tried to communicate through gestures or writing, as though the reminder of Georgiana's muteness was itself an accusation. Georgiana visited her mother once a month. She brought half her wages, 6 shillings of her 12, every week, and left them on the table in an envelope. Her mother took the money without thanks and spoke to her in the flat, exhausted tone of a woman who had run out of feeling years ago. "You look thin," she would say. Or, "Mrs. Fletcher downstairs says her niece has found a position in a milliner's. You might try that." Or, once, in a moment of unusual cruelty, "I sometimes think God took your voice as a kindness. You never had much worth saying." Georgiana absorbed these visits the way she absorbed everything, silently, completely, with the internal stillness of deep water that shows nothing on its surface but holds everything below. She never cried in front of her mother. She saved that for the walk home, where the noise of the streets covered whatever sounds her damaged throat could produce. Not words, but something more primal than words. The raw sound of a heart being bruised by the person who was supposed to protect it. This was the Mother Lady Hathaway went to visit. She arrived in a carriage. She wore silk. She brought a basket of food: ham, cheese, fresh bread, a bottle of good wine, the kind of calculated generosity that looks like kindness and functions as a bribe. And she sat in Anne Lyle's cramped parlour and told her, with great concern and compassion, that her daughter was making a terrible mistake. "I understand the appeal," Lady Hathaway said, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her expression arranged in perfect sympathy. A duke, even a blind one. Any girl would be flattered by the attention. But I must be honest with you, Mrs. Lyle, because no one else will. Your daughter is being used. The Duke requires a servant, someone to attend to his personal needs, to manage the details that his condition makes difficult. He has chosen your daughter because she is convenient, because she is quiet, because she will not make demands." Anne Lyle listened. She said nothing, but her jaw tightened in a way that Georgiana would have recognized, the particular set of a mouth that has found confirmation for a belief it already held. "When he tires of her," Lady Hathaway continued, "and he will tire of her. A duke does not marry a seamstress, Mrs. Lyle, not in any version of England I know. She will be left with nothing, less than nothing. Her reputation will be ruined. No respectable shop will employ her. She will have traded her livelihood for a fantasy." "She was always fanciful," Anne Lyle said, and the bitterness in her voice was so familiar, so deeply worn, that it barely registered as bitterness anymore. It was simply her tone. Even as a child, before the fire, always in her own world. "Then she needs someone to bring her back to the real one," Lady Hathaway said, "before it's too late." She left the basket, she left her card, and she left behind a mother whose resentment had just been given a target and a permission it had never had before. Anne Lyle went to Grosvenor Square the next day. Georgiana was in the study when the housekeeper knocked and said, in a voice of carefully controlled alarm, that her mother was downstairs and would not leave. The Duke heard the change in Georgiana's breathing immediately. "What is it?" His head turned toward her with that precise, listening tilt. "Your pulse just changed. I can hear it." She traced on his palm. "Mothehere. "Your mother is here?" 2 taps. "Yes." "Do you want to see her?" A pause. Then 1 tap. "No." "But you're going to." 2 taps. "Yes." He reached for her hand and held it, not the way he held it when they were communicating, but simply held it, his fingers interlacing with hers, his thumb pressing into her palm as though he could transfer some of his own formidable will directly into her bloodstream. "Come back to me," he said. It was not a request. It was the voice of a duke, the voice of command, of authority, of a man who had spent his entire life being obeyed. "Whatever she says to you, come back to me." Georgiana squeezed his hand. Then she went downstairs. Her mother was standing in the entrance hall looking both defiant and diminished. A small woman in a mended coat, in a house that could have swallowed her own home 100 times over. When she saw Georgiana, her face arranged itself into an expression that was not quite anger and not quite concern, but something in between that was worse than either. "You stupid girl," she said. The words were quiet, precise, delivered with the efficiency of a woman who had learned to wound in whispers. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? What people are saying? A mute seamstress visiting a duke 3 times a week. What do you think they think is happening? They think you're his whore, Georgiana. Is that what you want? Is that what your father died for?" Georgiana stood still. She did not reach for her notebook. She did not gesture. She simply stood and let the words land. The way she always did, the way she had trained herself to do since she was 12 years old, and understood for the first time that her mother's grief had become a weapon, and she was the target. "He will never marry you," her mother continued. "A duke, you. Look at yourself. You can't even speak. What would you do at his dinner table? At a ball? When his friends come to call? You would sit there like a lump, like a stone, like nothing." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, just a moment, Georgiana saw something beneath the cruelty. Fear. The particular fear of a woman who had lost everything once and was terrified of watching it happen again to the only person she had left, even if that person was the one she treated worst. But the moment passed. Anne Lyle gathered herself, gathered her coat around her like armor, and said, "You will stop coming here. If you have any sense left, any at all, you will stop." She left without waiting for a response. She had never waited for Georgiana's responses. The absence of a voice made it easy to pretend there was nothing to respond to. Georgiana stood in the entrance hall for a long time after her mother left. The footman pretended not to see her. The housekeeper pretended not to hear the ragged, soundless breathing that was as close to crying as Georgiana could come in the presence of others. Then she climbed the stairs. She opened the study door. And the Duke, who had been standing by the window, who had pressed his palm against the glass as though he could feel the street below, as though he could track her mother's departure through the vibration of the world, turned toward her and said nothing. He simply opened his arms. And Georgiana, who had not been held by anyone in 11 years, walked into them and broke. She did not cry the way people cry in stories, beautifully, with tears sliding elegantly down porcelain cheeks. She shook. Her whole body shook, soundless and terrible. The sobs trapped in her ruined throat with nowhere to go, building in her chest until she thought she would crack apart from the pressure of them. He held her through all of it. His arms were strong, stronger than she had expected. The arms of a man who had once been physical, who had ridden and hunted and fenced before the world went dark, and they held her with a ferocity that went beyond comfort. It was possession. It was claim. It was a man who had found the one thing in his lightless world that mattered and was holding on to it with everything he had. "Listen to me," he said, his mouth against her hair, his voice vibrating through her bones. "I cannot see you. I will never see you. But I know exactly what you are. I have known from the first moment you traced your name on my palm. And no one, not your mother, not society, not God himself, is going to take you from this room. Do you hear me?" She pressed her hand to his chest, 2 taps against his heart. "Yes. Good." He pulled her closer. "Then stay." And this is where I want to talk about something that I think will resonate with many of you listening right now. The scene you just heard, Georgiana's mother coming to that house and saying those things, it's not just fiction. It's something that happens in real life, in 1,000 different forms, every single day. People who are supposed to love us the most sometimes become the people who hurt us the deepest. Not because they're evil, not because they don't care, but because their own pain has become so large, so all-consuming that they can't see ours anymore. Anne Lyle lost her husband. She lost her home. She lost the life she thought she would have. And instead of turning to her daughter, her living, surviving, extraordinary daughter, she turned against her. Because Georgiana's survival reminded her of what she'd lost, and that reminder was unbearable. I say this not to excuse her, but to explain her. Because understanding the wound doesn't mean accepting the weapon. Now back to our story. It was during the 7th week of her visits that the jealousy arrived. His name was Mr. Oliver Stannard, and he was everything that Georgiana was not. Articulate, charming, and relentlessly, exhaustingly present. He was 26, the younger son of a baronet. Recently come to London to study law at the Inns of Court, and he had wandered into Mrs. Holt's shop on a Thursday morning, looking for a seamstress to repair a torn coat lining. He had found Georgiana. He was, she had to admit this, even to herself, handsome, fair-haired and blue-eyed, with the easy, open smile of a man who had never in his life had to work for attention. He was also persistent. When he discovered that the seamstress who had repaired his coat with such remarkable skill could not speak, he was not deterred. If anything, he was fascinated. "You communicate through writing?" he asked, leaning against the counter with the casual confidence of a man who assumed all spaces welcomed him. "How extraordinary. May I see?" Georgiana showed him her notebook. He read through several pages with genuine interest, asking questions about her work, her methods, her daily routine. She answered in writing, because writing was all she had, and because there was nothing threatening about his curiosity. It was the simple, uncomplicated interest of a young man who found something novel and wished to understand it. He came back the next week, and the week after that. Not for repairs. He invented pretexts. Transparent ones, a waistcoat that needed letting out, a cuff that was slightly too long. He talked while she worked. He was good at talking. He told her about his studies, his family, his ambitions. He made her almost laugh with his stories about the eccentricities of the other law students. He was, in short, kind, genuinely kind, in the uncomplicated way of a man whose life had not yet taught him that kindness could be complicated. And he was visible. He came to the shop in daylight. He stood at the counter and spoke to her openly. He treated her not as a curiosity or a charity case, but as a person he enjoyed spending time with. For Georgiana, who had spent 11 years in a world that did not see her, this was not nothing. It was not the shattering, bone-deep recognition she felt with the Duke. It was lighter than that, simpler. The kind of warmth a cat seeks when it sits in a patch of sunlight. Not love, but comfort. Not fire, but warmth. She did not tell the Duke about Mr. Stannard. There was nothing to tell, she reasoned. A customer who came to the shop. A man who talked while she sewed. It was nothing. But the Duke found out anyway. Because the Duke, despite his blindness, had Grieve. And Grieve, who monitored anything that touched the Duke's interests with the attentiveness of a man guarding the crown jewels, had noticed the young barrister's visits to Madame Delacroix's shop and had, in his thorough way, made inquiries. "A Mr. Oliver Stannard," Grieve reported, "younger son of Sir Walter Stannard of Sussex, reading law at Gray's Inn, unmarried. He has visited the shop 5 times in 3 weeks, ostensibly for tailoring work. The actual garments he has brought in were barely in need of repair." The Duke was silent. His hand, which had been resting on the arm of his chair, did not move. His face did not change. But something in the room shifted. A drop in temperature, a tightening of the air, that Grieve recognized with the instinct of long experience. "Does she know him?" the Duke asked. His voice was perfectly even, perfectly controlled, the voice of a man exerting significant effort to remain so. "They converse. He speaks. She writes. The interactions appear friendly." Friendly? Yes, Your Grace. The silence that followed was long enough to become uncomfortable. Grieve, who was not easily made uncomfortable, waited it out. Leave it, the Duke said finally. She is not mine to restrict. She may speak with whomever she wishes. Grieve withdrew. The Duke remained in his chair. And for the next 3 hours he did not move, did not call for anyone, did not do anything at all except sit in the darkened study and feel, with excruciating clarity, the particular agony of a man who cannot see the face of the person he loves and who has just learned that another man can. Georgiana came at her usual time the next afternoon. She knew something was wrong immediately. The Duke was standing by the window with its curtains drawn, as always, and his posture was different, rigid, contained. The relaxation she had coaxed out of him over 7 weeks of visits had vanished, replaced by the defensive stillness of the man she had first met. She touched his arm. He did not respond. She traced on his palm, WHATISWRONG. Nothing. The word was flat. A door closed and locked. She waited. She was good at waiting. 11 years of silence had taught her that some things could only be reached through patience. Finally he spoke. "Do you know a man named Stannard?" She went still. Then she traced HEISACUSTOMER. A customer who visits 5 times in 3 weeks for garments that do not need repair. She pulled her hand away. Not sharply. She was not angry. Not yet. But with a deliberateness that he felt and registered. She took his hand again and traced very slowly. AREYOUWATCHINGME. The question hung between them. And the Duke, who was honest, who was always honest, who had built his entire relationship with this woman on the foundation of unguarded truth, said, "Grieve watches. It is what he does. But yes, I knew, and He stopped. His jaw worked. "I have no right to feel what I'm feeling. You are not my wife. You are not my betrothed. You are a woman who comes to my house 3 times a week, and He stopped again. His hand found the mantelpiece and gripped it, and Georgiana could see the whiteness of his knuckles, even in the dim light. "I have been in this room for 3 years, he said, and his voice had gone raw, stripped bare in a way she had never heard from him. "I cannot see, I cannot go where I wish. I cannot ride or read or recognize the face of anyone who enters this house. The only thing in my entire life that I can feel, that I can know, that belongs to me, is what happens when you put your hand in mine, and the thought of another man—" His breath came in a shudder. "The thought of another man having what I have, your attention, your presence, your—" He could not finish. He turned his face away toward the window and its useless curtains, and Georgiana saw something she had never seen before. The Duke of Waverly was crying. Not sobbing, not weeping. The tears simply fell, silently, without drama, down the sharp planes of his face. And he made no move to wipe them away because he could not see them and perhaps did not know they were there. She crossed the room. She took his face in her hands, the way his mother would later do at the ball, though neither of them knew that yet. And she pressed her thumbs against the wet tracks on his cheeks. He flinched. Not from her touch. He never flinched from her touch. But from the realization that she was touching tears he had not meant to shed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I have no right." She pressed her fingers to his lips, traced against them. YOUHAVEEVERYRIGHT. Then she took his hand and pressed it to her chest, over her heart, which was beating so hard he must have felt it through her dress, through her stays, through every layer between his palm and the center of her. And she held it there while she traced on his other palm, letter by letter, the thing she had not yet said. IAMYOURS. ONLYYOURS. THEREISNOONE. ELSE. He read the letters. His hand trembled against her heart. And then he pulled her in. Not gently, not with the careful restraint he usually showed, but with the full, desperate force of a man who has been terrified of losing something and has just been told it is his. "Mine," he said, and the word was not a question or a declaration. It was a prayer. "Say it again. Let me feel it again." She traced it on his back, on his neck, on his chest. Y-O-U-R-S. 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 He held her so tightly she could not breathe, and she did not care. She had spent 11 years breathing without anyone to hold her. A few seconds without air was a small price to pay for this. Mr. Stannard came to the shop once more after that. Georgiana met him at the counter and wrote a brief, polite note. "Thank you for your kindness. I am spoken for. I wish you well." He read it, and to his credit, and he did have credit, he was a good man, merely a young one, he understood immediately. He smiled, a little sadly, bowed, and left. She never saw him again, and she was not sorry, and that was the end of that. But the jealousy had done its work. Not destructive work, not the kind that poisons and corrodes, clarifying work, the kind that strips away pretense and uncertainty and leaves only the essential truth. And the essential truth was this: they belonged to each other, completely, irrevocably, in a way that neither of them had chosen and neither of them would change. Then came the separation, and it was terrible. Lady Hathaway's campaign had been building for weeks, and Georgiana had been insulated from most of it by the simple fact of her deafness to gossip. She could not hear what people said about her, and the people who said things about her did not say them where she could read their lips. But the campaign had consequences that reached beyond words. Mrs. Holt received a visit from Lady Fenwick, one of Lady Hathaway's closest allies, on a Monday afternoon. The visit was brief and devastating. Lady Fenwick made it clear, in the genteel language of threat that the English upper classes had perfected over centuries, that Mrs. Holt's shop would lose every society client it had if she continued to employ the seamstress who was entangled with the Duke of Waverly. "It's not personal," Lady Fenwick said, adjusting her gloves, "but the girl's situation reflects on everyone associated with her. Surely you understand." Mrs. Holt understood. She was a businesswoman. She had 14 years of reputation invested in Madame Delacroix, and she could not afford to lose her fashionable clientele. She spent the evening calculating the weight of £8 from the Duke's commission against the weight of every other commission she would lose. And by morning the mathematics were clear. She told Georgiana on a Tuesday. She did it quickly, the way one tears off a bandage, and she had the grace to look ashamed while she did it. "I'm sorry, Georgiana, truly, but I can't, the shop can't afford—" She could not finish. She pressed an envelope into Georgiana's hands. 3 months' wages, more than she owed, a gesture of guilt dressed as generosity, and turned away. Georgiana packed her tools. She walked out of the shop on Barlow Street for the last time, carrying her case and her notebook and the 12 years of silence that had been her only constant companion, and she stood on the pavement in the April rain and felt the world close in around her like a fist. She did not go to Grosvenor Square. This was the decision that would later seem incomprehensible to the Duke, and to everyone who heard the story, and even to Georgiana herself when she looked back on it. But in the moment, it made a terrible, self-destructive kind of sense. Her mother's words were in her head. "You are nothing. You are broken. You are a girl the world has forgotten." And Lady Hathaway's campaign had confirmed them. She had lost her position because of her association with the Duke. She was costing him his reputation, his social standing, his privacy. Every newspaper in London was writing about the blind Duke's mute seamstress, and the words they used, pitiful, inappropriate, bewildering, were the words that had followed her all her life, and they were now following him too. She was a stone around his neck. That was what she told herself, standing in the rain on Barlow Street with her case in her hand and nowhere to go. She was pulling him down. And the kindest thing she could do, the only thing she could do, was let go. She went home to her room on Drury Lane. She did not send word. She did not write. She simply vanished. The way she had been vanishing for 22 years, the way the world had taught her to vanish, quietly, completely, as though she had never existed at all. The room was small and cold. It had never been warm. The fireplace was too small and the chimney drew poorly, and the windows let in draughts that made the candle flames dance sideways. But she had never noticed the cold before. She had come home to this room after 12 hours of sewing and felt only tiredness, the simple, honest exhaustion of a body that has done its work and wants its rest. Now the room was cold in a different way. It was cold the way empty things are cold, the way a hand is cold when it is not being held. She sat on her bed. She did not remove her coat. She did not light a candle. She sat in the dark, his kind of dark, she thought, and the thought was a blade. And she pressed her hands together, palm to palm, and felt the absence of his fingers against hers like a phantom limb. Her hands remembered everything. The texture of his palm, the ridge of callus on his right hand where he gripped the mantle, the way his pulse beat at his wrist, faster when she was close, steadier when she was not, the particular temperature of his skin, which was always slightly warmer than hers, so that touching him was like touching a sun-warmed stone. Her hands remembered, and her hands ached, and she folded them against her chest and bent over them in the darkness, and rocked like a child. She did not eat that night, or the next morning, or the next afternoon. By the second day, hunger had become an abstraction, something she knew about intellectually, but could not feel physically because every nerve in her body was occupied with a different kind of emptiness. She sewed the shirt. She sewed it by touch in the dark, the needle finding fabric the way his fingers found her pulse, by memory and instinct and the desperate need to create something, anything, that connected her to him. On the second night, she dreamed of the study. She dreamed of the fire in the grate and the books on the walls and the chair where he sat, and in the dream she could speak. She opened her mouth, and sound poured out. Not words, not language, just sound, the pure, raw, unformed sound of a voice that had been silent for 11 years. And in the dream he heard it. He turned toward her with that precise, listening tilt, and he smiled, and he said, "There you are. I've been waiting." She woke with her throat convulsing around silence. The dream was gone. The room was dark, and the cold was everywhere. The Duke, meanwhile, was unravelling. Grieve had never seen him like this. Not in the immediate aftermath of the accident, not in the worst of the depression that followed, not even in the terrible first weeks when the blindness was confirmed as permanent and the Duke had smashed every mirror in the house with a poker before realizing, with a laugh that was closer to a scream, that he was destroying things he could no longer see. This was different. This was quieter, more frightening. The Duke did not rage. He did not smash things. He simply stopped. Stopped eating. Stopped sleeping. Stopped moving from the study, where he stood by the fireplace. Hour after hour, his hand on the mantel, his head bowed, listening to a silence that told him nothing. Grieve brought him food. The Duke did not touch it. Grieve brought him correspondence. The Duke did not acknowledge it. Grieve, who had served this man for 20 years and had weathered every storm with the same unflappable neutrality, stood in the doorway of the study on the second morning, and felt, for the first time in his career, genuinely afraid. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "you need to eat." "I need her." The Duke's voice was flat, dead. The voice of a man who has given up pretending that he is functioning. I need her to come back, and she won't, because she thinks she's doing the right thing. And she is wrong, Grieve. She is catastrophically wrong, and I cannot tell her because I cannot go to her because I cannot see the bloody street. His hand slammed against the mantel. The sound echoed through the empty room. And then the sound that followed it was worse. A ragged, choked, half-swallowed sob from a man who had not made such a sound since the night he learned he would be blind forever. Grieve made a decision. I will go to her, Your Grace. She won't come. Then I will go again, and again if necessary. And if she still won't come, Grieve considered this, then I will bring Mrs. Holt to you, and you will explain to Mrs. Holt exactly what you think of her decision to dismiss the woman you love because a society matron with debts threatened her business. The Duke raised his head. The rage was back, cold and precise and architectural, and Grieve welcomed it, because rage was better than despair. Rage was something that could be directed. Yes, the Duke said. Bring Mrs. Holt. Mrs. Holt arrived at Grosvenor Square the following morning in a state of barely concealed terror. She had dressed in her best, the same calculating reflex that had led her to name her shop after a fictional Frenchwoman, but no amount of careful dressing could prepare a woman for the experience of being ushered into the study of a blind duke whose fury filled the room like smoke. He did not offer her a seat. He did not greet her. He stood by the fireplace. Where else? And when the door closed behind her, he spoke. You're wearing rosewater. Not your usual scent, that's all wonderwoo. That's lye, soap and sizing. The smell of a working shop. You dressed for this visit, which means you already know why you're here. Mrs. Holt went rigid. She had not said a word. He had read her from the air alone. You dismissed Georgiana Lyle. Your Grace, Your voice is pitched higher than normal, and you shifted your weight to your left foot when you heard her name. You're frightened. He tilted his head. That precise listening tilt that Georgiana had catalogued 100 times. You should be, but not of me. Of what you did. He let the silence stretch. 3 seconds. 5. Long enough for Mrs. Holt's breathing to become audible. Then he continued. You dismissed the finest seamstress in London, a woman who has worked in your shop for 6 years without complaint, without error, without a single commission returned, because Lady Fenwick told you to. I can hear your heartbeat from here, Mrs. Holt. It tells me you know exactly how wrong that was. Mrs. Holt's face was white. Your Grace, your business will be my concern from this moment forward. The Duke's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Quiet authority in the right register is more terrifying than any shout. I am going to tell you what will happen. You will reinstate Georgiana's position immediately. You will write to Lady Fenwick and inform her that the Duke of Waverly has taken a personal interest in the matter, and that any further interference with his affairs will be met with consequences that Lady Fenwick's social position is not equipped to survive. And you will pay Georgiana her full wages for the weeks she has been absent. Mrs. Holt opened her mouth. I am not finished, and you just opened your reticule. The clasp makes a particular sound. If you are reaching for smelling salts, you may use them. If you are reaching for anything else, I would advise against it. The Duke took a step forward. If Georgiana chooses not to return to your shop, and she may not, given how you treated her, you will provide her with a letter of reference that reflects 6 years of exemplary service. You will not mention her condition. You will not mention me. You will describe her skill, her reliability, and her professionalism, because that is the truth, and because the truth is the very least you owe her. Mrs. Holt was silent. She was shaking. The Duke's voice softened. Not much, but enough. I do not blame you entirely, Mrs. Holt. Lady Fenwick is a formidable woman, and your livelihood was at stake. But you chose your business over a person who gave you 6 years of loyalty, and that is a choice you will have to live with. I will not make it easy for you, but I will not destroy you either. Do we understand each other? Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Holt's voice was barely a whisper. We understand each other. Good. Grieve will show you out. Mrs. Holt left. She did write the letter of reference. She did pay the wages. And she did send a note to Georgiana. Not an apology exactly, but something adjacent to one, that read, I am sorry for the way it happened. You were the best hands I ever employed. I wish you well. Georgiana received the note after her return to Grosvenor Square. She read it once, folded it, and put it away. She did not feel anger toward Mrs. Holt. She did not feel much of anything toward Mrs. Holt. The woman had done what the world always did to people like Georgiana, used her when she was convenient and discarded her when she was not. It was not personal. It was simply the arithmetic of survival as the world understood it. Georgiana had different arithmetic now. She had a duke. She had a language. She had a home where the curtains were about to be thrown open and the light was about to come flooding in. She did not need Mrs. Holt's shop. She had never needed Mrs. Holt's shop. She had needed what the shop represented. A place in the world, a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. And she had found all of that, and more, in a darkened room on Grosvenor Square where a blind man had held out his hand and said, I suppose we shall have to find another way. The Duke waited for her that afternoon. 2 o'clock came and went. 3 o'clock. 4. By 5, his composure, the careful, deliberate composure of a man who controlled his environment through ritual and routine because he could control nothing else, had fractured completely. Where is she? He demanded of Grieve, and the controlled voice was gone, replaced by something raw and barely contained. She has never been late, not once. Where is she? Grieve investigated. It took him less than an hour to discover that Georgiana had been dismissed from Mrs. Holt's shop. It took him another hour to learn that Lady Fenwick had made the visit that precipitated the dismissal. And it took him 3 more hours. 3 hours during which the Duke paced the study like a caged animal, his hands clenched at his sides, his useless eyes burning with a rage that was all the more terrifying for having no target, to discover that Georgiana had returned to her room on Drury Lane and had not left it. She won't see me, the Duke said. It was not a question. He knew her. He knew the architecture of her self-protection, the way she withdrew into silence and stillness when the world became too much. He had recognized it because it was the same thing he had done for 3 years. She's convinced herself she's protecting me by staying away. That appears to be the case, Your Grace. She's wrong. Yes, Your Grace. Send her a note. She may not read it. Send it anyway, right? I am in the dark without you. Not the kind I can navigate. Come back, please. Sign it with my name. Grieve wrote the note. He delivered it personally to the room on Drury Lane. He slid it under the door. He waited for 40 minutes. No response came. He returned to Grosvenor Square and reported this to the Duke, who received the news in silence. The Duke stood by the fireplace, one hand on the mantel, his head bowed. He stayed like that for a long time. Then he said, "Leave me." Grieve left. The door closed, and in the privacy of his darkened study, the Duke of Waverly, who had not shown weakness to anyone except Georgiana, who had maintained his composure through 3 years of blindness and isolation and the daily humiliation of dependence, put his face in his hands and wept. Not the silent tears of the jealousy scene. These were wrenching, full-bodied sobs that shook his frame and echoed off the walls of the empty room. Wept because she was gone. He wept because the world had taken her from him the same way it had taken his sight. Gradually, inevitably, through forces he could not fight, because he could not see them coming. He wept because the silence in the room, the silence that had been his companion for 3 years and had felt bearable only because he knew she would fill it 3 times a week, was now absolute and permanent. And the most terrible sound he had ever heard was the sound of a room where Georgiana Lyle was not breathing. Now, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, just go to her, you fool, I understand. But you have to remember, this is a man who cannot see. He cannot walk to Drury Lane alone. He cannot find her door. He cannot look into her eyes and make her understand. Every tool that other men would use to fight for the woman they love, the grand gesture, the pursuit, the physical presence, was denied to him. He was trapped in his house by the same disability that had trapped him for 3 years, and the woman who had been his freedom was the one person he could not reach. That is the particular cruelty of their situation. 2 people perfectly designed to understand each other, separated by the very limitations that had brought them together. On Drury Lane, Georgiana was not faring better. She had read the Duke's note. She had read it 17 times. She knew, because she counted, the way she counted everything. His smiles, his heartbeats, the number of steps between the study door and the fireplace where he stood. She read the note, and she held it against her chest, and she did not go to him because she believed, with the absolute conviction of a woman who had been told she was nothing for 22 years, that her absence was a gift. She did not eat. She barely slept. She sat in her room with the curtains drawn, an unconscious echo of the Duke's own exile, though she did not recognize it as such, and she sewed. Not for a client, not for anyone. She sewed the way other people prayed, with desperate, repetitive focus, her needle moving through fabric in the darkness, creating something beautiful, because creating was the only thing she knew how to do when everything else was falling apart. She sewed a shirt, one of the 12 patterns she had cut for him. She sewed it from memory, without measurements, without light, by touch alone, the way he experienced the world. She felt the fabric the way he felt it. She read the seams with her fingertips the way he read everything. And when it was finished, she held it to her face and breathed in the cotton and the sizing and the lavender from her tool case. And she cried the way she always cried, silently, violently, her ruined throat convulsing around sounds that could not escape. 3 days passed. They were the longest 3 days of either of their lives. On the 3rd evening, something happened that forced the situation to its crisis. Georgiana was returning from the pump at the end of Drury Lane. She had gone for water because, even in despair, one must drink, when a man stepped out of the shadows of the alley beside the chandler's shop. She did not recognize him. He was rough, thick-bodied, with the look of a dock worker or a hired hand. He blocked her path. "You the mute girl?" he said. "The one mixed up with the Duke?" She stepped back. Her heart was hammering. The street was dim. Gaslights were sparse on Drury Lane, and the chandler's shop was closed for the evening. "Lady sends a message," the man said, and his tone was not threatening but businesslike, which was somehow worse. "She says you should take what's been offered and go. Leave London. There's a position in a factory in Manchester. Good wages, steady work. She'll pay your passage. All you have to do is leave, tonight." Georgiana shook her head. She backed away another step. The man's expression hardened. "She said you might be stubborn about it." He moved closer. His hand closed around her arm. Not violently, but firmly, the grip of a man who was accustomed to handling objects that resisted. She also said to tell you that if you don't go willingly, things get harder for you. For your mum too. The old woman on Cheapside. Be a shame if her landlord raised the rent, wouldn't it? Be a shame if the greengrocer decided he didn't want a tenant anymore. Georgiana did not drop the water jug. She swung it. The clay struck the man's forearm with a crack that echoed off the brick walls of the alley, and the shock of the impact, her shock as much as his, ran through both of them like a current. He released her arm, not because the blow had hurt him badly, but because he had not expected it. He had been told he was collecting a mute girl, a seamstress, a quiet nobody who would fold under pressure. He had not been told she was the kind of woman who had survived a fire at 11, rebuilt her life in silence, and endured 22 years of being dismissed by every person she had ever met. He had not been told that Georgiana Lyle was not easy to break. "You stupid!" He reached for her again, his hand closing on her wrist this time, harder, and she felt the bruise forming even as he gripped her. She pulled back. He pulled forward, and the water jug, still in her other hand, came up again, but this time he was ready, and he knocked it from her fingers. It shattered on the cobblestones. Now, I want to be clear about something. What you're hearing right now, a mute woman, alone on a dark street, outnumbered and outweighed, this is the moment where everything that happened before and everything that happens after pivots. This is the hinge, so keep listening. The sound of the jug breaking was sharp in the quiet street, sharp enough to draw the attention of a man at the end of the lane, a man who had been stationed at the pub across the road for 2 hours, nursing a single ale, because he was the kind of man who anticipated problems the way other people anticipated meals. Mr. Silas Grieve had been watching Georgiana's lodgings since the separation began. Not on the Duke's orders, but on his own initiative, because 20 years of service to the Ashby family had taught him that the people his master loved were the people most likely to need protection. What happened next was swift and silent, and entirely characteristic of Mr. Silas Grieve. He crossed the street in 6 strides. He placed his hand on the rough man's shoulder, a light touch, almost gentle, and he said in a voice that was as neutral and expressionless as his face, "Remove your hand from the lady, or I will remove it from your wrist." The man looked at Grieve. Grieve was thin. Grieve was not physically imposing, but there was something in his eyes, a quality of absolute dispassionate certainty that communicated more effectively than any threat. The rough man released Georgiana's wrist. He stepped back. "Tell your employer," Grieve said, "that the Duke of Waverly sends his regards, and that if any further contact is made with Miss Lyle, her mother, or anyone associated with either of them, the Duke will pursue the matter through every legal and social channel available to him, which, given that he is the 6th Duke of Waverly and commands resources that Lady Hathaway cannot begin to imagine, will be comprehensive and permanent." The man left. Grieve did not watch him go. He turned to Georgiana, who was standing among the shards of her broken water jug with a red welt rising on her wrist and her breath coming in the ragged, silent gasps that were her version of crying. And he said, with a gentleness that she would never have expected from a man with a face like a closed book, "Miss Lyle, it's time to come home." She went. She did not argue. She did not resist. She climbed into the carriage that Grieve had waiting around the corner, because of course he had a carriage waiting. Grieve always had a carriage waiting. And she sat in it, with her hands clasped in her lap and her heart beating so fast it felt like a bird trapped in her chest, and she rode through the dark streets of London toward Grosvenor Square. The house was dark when she arrived, not the darkness of drawn curtains. The curtains were, for the first time, open, but the darkness of late evening, of a house where only the entrance hall and the study were still lit. The footman opened the door without expression. Grieve guided her upstairs. The study door was ajar. candlelight spilled through the gap, warm and gold, and standing by the fireplace, where he always stood, where he would always stand in her memory of this room, was the Duke. He had not slept in 3 days. She could see it. The hollows beneath his cheekbones were deeper. His eyes were red-rimmed. His shirt, one of the 12 she had made for him, was rumpled, unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves pushed to his elbows as though he had been pacing for hours, and the confinement of clothing had become intolerable. He turned his head when the door moved. His entire body went rigid. "Lavender," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. She crossed the room. She took his hand. She placed it on her chest, over her heart, the way she had done when she told him she was his. And his hand, his beautiful, scarred, aristocratic hand, spread across her chest and felt what was there. Her heartbeat, rapid and unsteady. Her breath shallow and quick. The warmth of her skin through her dress. The fact of her alive, present, here. 3 days, he said. His forehead dropped to hers. 3 days! Don't ever... He could not finish. His hands moved to her face, her neck, her shoulders, mapping her the way he mapped everything. Through touch, through the only sense left to him, confirming that she was real and whole and standing in front of him. She traced on his palm, I-A-M-S-O-R-R-Y. Don't apologize, just... He pulled her against him and held her, and his arms were shaking, and his breath was ragged, and she could feel the 3 days of anguish in every line of his body. Don't leave. Don't ever leave again. I don't care what they say. I don't care what they do. You are the only thing... His voice broke completely. The only thing I need to see, and I can't even do that. But I need you here. I need... She pressed her fingers to his throat. She shaped the word she had given him before. Stay. He felt it. And this time, unlike the first time when the word had been a request, it was a vow, from both of them, spoken in their language, sealed against skin. "I'm going to marry you," he said. The words were not romantic. They were fierce, almost angry, the declaration of a man who had spent 3 days staring into an abyss, and had decided that he would burn the world down before he let it take her again. "I am going to marry you, and I am going to make it so public, so absolute, so irrevocable that no one, not Lady Hathaway, not your mother, not God himself, can ever separate us again. Do you hear me?" She tapped his chest twice. "Yes." "Is that what you want?" 2 taps. "Yes." "Then it's done. Grieve." Grieve, who had been standing in the hallway, appeared immediately. "Your Grace, send for my mother tomorrow morning." "Yes, Your Grace. And find out who hired the man on Drury Lane." "I believe I already know, Your Grace." "Good. We'll deal with that. But first..." He looked down at Georgiana, or rather turned his face toward her in the way he always did when he wanted her to know she had his full attention. "First, you're going to eat. You look thin. I can feel your ribs." "I can feel yours," Kitty Phelps would later point out when the story was told to her. But that was a conversation for another day. That night, Georgiana ate. She ate soup and bread and cold chicken. And cheese, sitting in the Duke's study while he sat across from her, and did not eat, but simply listened. To the sound of her spoon, to the clink of the plate, to the small, quiet sounds of a woman existing in his space, filling the silence that had nearly destroyed him. When she was finished, he took her hand. "Stay tonight," he said. "Not... I don't mean..." He cleared his throat, and for the first time since she had known him, the Duke of Waverly blushed. "There are guest rooms, 20 of them. Mrs. Hargrave will see to it. I cannot..." She traced IUNDERSTAND, then IWILLSTAY. He exhaled. The sound of it was like a man setting down a weight he had been carrying for days. "Good," he said. "Good." He did not let go of her hand for a very long time. The season arrived in April like a tide, flooding London with carriages and debutantes, and the particular species of aggressive optimism that characterized the annual marriage market. Every house on the fashionable squares was suddenly lit and occupied. Every ballroom was suddenly full, and the name on everyone's lips, whispered over tea, debated over cards, dissected at every dinner table from Mayfair to Marylebone, was the Duke of Waverley's. Because the Duke had done something extraordinary, something unprecedented, something that sent shockwaves through the ton with the force of a cannon shot. He had left his house, not alone. He had emerged from the front door of his Grosvenor Square residence at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, with a young woman on his arm, a young woman no one recognized, a young woman who was plainly dressed and said nothing to anyone, and walked beside him with her hand resting in the crook of his elbow as though it belonged there, as though it had always belonged there. The Duke was dressed immaculately. His dark hair was cut. His jaw was shaved. His posture, always commanding even in his years of isolation, was straighter than it had been in 3 years. He walked through Grosvenor Square with the particular, deliberate grace of a man who could not see where he was going but refused to let anyone know it, and the woman beside him guided him so subtly, so seamlessly. A slight pressure on his arm for direction, a tap of her finger for steps, that unless you were watching very closely, you would not have known he was blind at all. They walked to Hyde Park. They walked along the Serpentine. They did not speak, or rather he spoke, low and private, and she answered him in a way that no observer could decipher, her fingers moving against his arm in patterns that looked random, but were clearly not. London nearly expired from curiosity. "Who is she?" demanded Lady Fenwick at the evening's first gathering. "A companion, surely," offered Mrs. Barton Clark. "A nurse of some kind." "She's not dressed like a nurse," observed Miss Pettifer, who had been watching from her carriage and had noted every detail with the precision of a professional spy. "She's nobody," said Lady Hathaway, and the temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. "She is a seamstress, a common tradesperson, and she is mute." The silence that followed this pronouncement was absolute. "Mute," repeated Lady Fenwick, as though the word itself was distasteful. "Cannot speak a single word. The daughter of a shopkeeper who burned to death in his own premises. The girl was scarred in the fire, hence the silence." Lady Hathaway's expression was one of studied compassion, the kind that conceals a blade. "It is, of course, desperately sad, but one does wonder about the Duke's judgment. A man in his condition, so isolated, so vulnerable, one can see how he might become attached to the first person who showed him kindness, even if that person is entirely unsuitable." The word unsuitable landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spread. By the following morning, half of London knew that the blind Duke of Waverly was keeping company with a mute seamstress. By the afternoon, the other half knew too, and the opinions divided along exactly the lines Lady Hathaway had intended. Some thought it was romantic, most thought it was a scandal, and nearly everyone agreed that it could not possibly end well. The Duke, who could not read the newspapers and did not receive callers, was entirely unaware of the storm he had created. Georgiana, who could not hear the gossip and moved through the world in her bubble of silence, was equally oblivious. They continued to walk in the park. They continued to speak their private language. And London continued to watch. It was Mr. Silas Grieve who brought the truth to the Duke's attention. Grieve was not the Duke's valet. The Duke had dismissed his valet 3 years ago and refused to hire another. Grieve was something more difficult to define. The Duke's man, his manager, his connection To the outside world, he was 41 years old, thin as a blade, and possessed of a face so neutral it could have been used as a blank canvas. He had served the Ashby family for 20 years, first as a footman, then as the old Duke's secretary, and now as whatever Theodore needed him to be, which varied from hour to hour and was never, ever boring. He found the Duke in the study. Where else? And delivered his intelligence with the directness that was the foundation of their relationship. "There is talk," Grieve said, "about the young woman." "Georgiana," the Duke said. "Not the seamstress, not the girl, her name." "Yes, Lady Hathaway has been active." "Lady Hathaway?" The Duke's voice went flat. "Lydia Hathaway's mother." "The same. She visited Miss Lyle's mother last week. Since then, the mother has been vocal in her opposition, and Lady Hathaway has been distributing the story through her channels. The Ton is aware. The general consensus is that you are vulnerable, that the young woman is taking advantage, and that an intervention is necessary." The Duke's expression did not change, but his hand, the hand that rested on the arm of his chair, tightened until the knuckles went white. "An intervention," he repeated. "Lady Hathaway has approached your mother. She has suggested that a suitable match, her daughter naturally, would demonstrate to society that your judgment remains sound, that the seamstress was merely a phase, a kindness extended too far." The silence that followed was terrible, not angry, not sad. Terrible in the way that a very still sea is terrible, the kind of calm that precedes a storm of catastrophic proportions. "Grieve," the Duke said. "Your Grace." "How long have I known you?" 20 years, Your Grace." "In those 20 years, have you ever known me to be managed?" "No, Your Grace." "Have you ever known me to be manipulated?" "No, Your Grace." "Have you ever known me to allow anyone to decide whom I may keep company with?" "No, Your Grace." "Then you will understand when I say this." The Duke leaned forward. His grey eyes, unfocused and useless, were nonetheless directed at Grieve, with an intensity that the man felt like a physical force. "Lady Hathaway has made an error. She has touched something of mine, and I am going to correct that error so thoroughly that she will spend the rest of her natural life wishing she had left the matter alone." Grieve, who had seen the Duke in many moods over 20 years, recognized this one. It was not anger. Anger burned hot and passed. This was something colder, something architectural. The Duke was not losing his temper. He was making a plan. "What do you require?" Grieve asked. "Information," the Duke said. "Everything you can find about Lady Hathaway's finances, her social alliances, and her daughter's prospects. Every debt, every secret, every vulnerability." "And Miss Lyle?" The Duke's expression changed, softened, became something that Grieve, in 20 years of service, had never seen before. "Miss Lyle," the Duke said, "is going to be my wife." Grieve blinked. It was the most dramatic reaction he had ever displayed. "Your Grace, she is a seamstress." "I am aware." "She cannot speak." "I am also aware. I am blind, Grieve. I am not an idiot." "The Ton will—" "The Ton," the Duke said, "will do what I tell it to do. That is the privilege of being a Duke. It is, in fact, the only privilege that matters." He stood, moved to the fireplace with the unerring certainty of a man who had mapped every inch of this room with his hands and his feet and his remaining senses, placed his hand on the mantel. "There is something else," he said. "Something I have not told anyone, not even Georgiana." Grieve waited. "I am not entirely blind," the Duke said quietly. "It has been coming back, slowly, over the past 3 months. Shadows at first, then shapes." He paused. "The doctors examined my eyes and found nothing wrong with them. They never did. The damage was here." He touched his temple. "In the brain itself, where the fall struck. The Edinburgh physician, the one Mother brought in last year, the one who studies injuries of the head. He told me privately that in cases like mine, where the eyes are intact but the brain has been bruised, there was a small chance the sight could return as the swelling resolved. A very small chance. Years, he said, if it happened at all. His hand dropped from his temple. It is happening. I can see light. I can see movement. I can see the shape of her when she's near me. I cannot see her face, but I can see that she is there. The room was very quiet. When I look at her, the Duke continued, she is the only shape in my darkness that has any definition. Everything else is shadow. She is the only thing I can almost see. Grieve said nothing for a moment. Then, does she know? No. And you will not tell her? Not yet. I want to, when I can see her face, Grieve. I want that moment to be mine. Understood, Your Grace. Good. Now, Lady Hathaway, begin. Grieve worked quickly. He was, as it happened, exceptionally good at gathering information, a skill he had developed over 2 decades of managing ducal affairs, and which he now applied with the focused intensity of a man who had been given a mission by someone he genuinely respected. What he discovered about Lady Hathaway was illuminating. The Hathaway fortune, such as it was, rested on a foundation considerably less stable than Lady Hathaway's social position would suggest. Sir Reginald Hathaway had died leaving debts that his widow had spent a decade concealing. Debts that she had managed, reduced, and strategically restructured, but never fully eliminated. The £8,000 dowry she advertised for Lydia was real, but it represented virtually all of the family's remaining liquid assets. If Lydia did not marry well, and soon, the Hathaways would face the genteel poverty that was the particular nightmare of the English upper middle class. The kind of poverty that could not be admitted, that must be concealed behind silk dresses and hired carriages, and that consumed its victims from the inside out. Lady Hathaway's social power, Grieve discovered, was similarly more fragile than it appeared. She maintained her position through a careful balance of favours, given and secrets kept. She knew things about people, and people were kind to her because they feared what she might say if they were not. But this was a declining currency. The women she had cultivated were aging out of influence. The new generation of society hostesses did not owe her anything. And Lydia, poor, pleasant, utterly unremarkable Lydia, was not the kind of girl who inspired devotion or alliance. She was a pawn, and her mother was running out of moves. All of this Grieve delivered to the Duke in a single, comprehensive briefing on a Wednesday afternoon, while Georgiana was at the shop, and the house was quiet. The Duke listened. He did not interrupt. When Grieve finished, he was silent for a long time. "She is afraid," the Duke said finally. "Your Grace?" "Lady Hathaway. She's not a villain. She's a mother with a daughter she can't provide for, and she's running out of time, and she saw an opportunity, and she took it. I understand the impulse." He paused. "I don't forgive it, but I understand it. What would you like me to do?" "Nothing yet. I'm not going to destroy her. I'm going to make her irrelevant. There's a difference." He turned toward the window. "But first I need to speak with my mother." Lady Ashby, the Dowager Duchess of Waverly, was 61 years old, possessed of a spine like an iron rod and a social acumen that made Lady Hathaway look like a clumsy amateur. She had managed the Waverly interests for 40 years, first alongside her husband and then, after his death, alongside a succession of men of business whom she selected, supervised, and occasionally terrified. When her son had lost his sight, she had grieved privately and managed publicly, maintaining the family's social position through sheer force of will, while Theodore retreated into his silent house. She visited him once a month, as the gossips reported. What the gossips did not report was that these visits were not tearful. They were strategic. Lady Ashby and her son discussed estate matters, parliamentary affairs, and the various machinations of the people around them, with the dispassionate efficiency of two generals reviewing a campaign. She loved him fiercely. She also treated him as an equal, which was more valuable than love. When Theodore told her about Georgiana, she listened without interruption. When he told her about Lady Hathaway, her expression hardened. And when he told her that he intended to marry the seamstress, she was silent for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to absorb the information, brief enough to signal that she was not shocked. "You're certain," she said. "I have never been more certain of anything." She cannot speak. She speaks to me in a way no one else ever has. Society will talk. Society always talks. That is what society does. It has never stopped us before. Lady Ashby studied her son. And even though he could not see the study, he could feel it, the weight of her attention like a physical thing. She had been watching him since the accident. She had watched him withdraw, darken, diminish. She had watched the light leave him. Not the light in his eyes, which was gone, but the light in his spirit, which had dimmed to almost nothing. And in the past 2 months, she had watched it return. He stood straighter. He spoke with more precision. He had left his house. He had cut his hair. She was not a sentimental woman, but she was an intelligent one. And she could see, even if he could not, that whoever this girl was, she had done something that 3 years of doctors and visitors and maternal concern had failed to do. She had brought him back. "I will need to meet her," Lady Ashby said. "Of course. And I will need time to prepare the ground. If you present her to society without preparation, Lady Hathaway will not be your only problem. Every mother with an unmarried daughter will have her knives out. I know. You will need to be public about it, visible. If you try to do this quietly, they will paint it as shame, as though you know it's wrong and are trying to hide it. I know that too. And Theodore," she paused, "you will need to be kind to the girl, not just loving, kind. The world she is about to enter will try to crush her. You must make sure it cannot." The Duke's jaw tightened. "I will make sure," he said, "that anyone who tries will wish they hadn't." Lady Ashby regarded him. Then, for the first time in 3 years, she smiled. It was small and sharp and fierce, and it contained more pride than she had felt since the day he was born. "Good," she said. "Then let us begin." The meeting between Georgiana and Lady Ashby took place on a Thursday afternoon in the drawing-room of the Grosvenor Square house, a room that had been closed for 3 years and was now, at the Duke's instruction, opened, cleaned, and lit with more candles than the room had seen in its existence. The curtains were drawn back, the furniture was uncovered. The flowers, roses and lilies, had been arranged by Grieve, who had approached the task with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, resulting in arrangements that were technically perfect and emotionally neutral. Georgiana arrived at 2 o'clock. She had been told about the meeting the day before, through the Duke's hands, and she had spent the intervening 24 hours in a state of controlled terror that she managed to conceal from everyone except him, because concealing things from a man who read your heartbeat through your fingertips was, she was discovering, impossible. "She will try to intimidate you," he had told her, "not because she's cruel, because she needs to know if you can withstand it. My mother does not accept weakness, Georgiana, but she respects honesty absolutely." She was wearing her best dress, a grey wool that she had made herself, well-fitted and well-finished, but utterly plain. She had considered wearing something finer. There were fabrics in the shop she could have borrowed. But that would have been a lie. And she had decided, standing in her room at dawn that morning, that she would not begin this, by pretending to be something she was not. Lady Ashby was already seated when Georgiana entered. She was a tall woman, thin in the way that aristocratic women were thin, from discipline rather than deprivation, with silver hair drawn back severely and grey eyes that were startlingly similar to her son's. She wore black, as she had since the Duke's accident, and she regarded Georgiana with an expression that was neither warm nor cold. It was evaluative, the look of a woman who was about to decide something important and would not be hurried. The Duke stood between them. He could not see either woman, but he could feel the tension in the room the way other people could see it, as a physical quality of the air, a tightness, a held breath. "Mother," he said, "this is Georgiana Lyle." Georgiana curtsied. The gesture felt inadequate, like bringing a thimble to a flood, but it was all she had. Lady Ashby did not speak. She looked at Georgiana for a long time, at her grey dress, her honey-coloured hair, her watchful brown eyes, her scarred throat. She looked at her the way a jeweller examines a stone, searching for flaws that would diminish value. Then she said, "My son tells me you have built a language together." Georgiana glanced at the Duke. He nodded. She turned back to Lady Ashby and, after a moment's hesitation, held out her hand, palm up, the way she held it for him. Lady Ashby looked at the offered hand. Something shifted in her face. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of recognition. She had not been expecting this. She had been expecting deference, submission, perhaps tears. She had not been expecting an invitation. She placed her hand in Georgiana's. Georgiana traced, slowly and carefully, I-L-O-V-E-Y-O-U-R-S-O-N. Lady Ashby's fingers twitched. Her eyes moved to the Duke, who stood with his head tilted, listening, unable to see the exchange, but clearly desperate to know what was happening. "She says she loves you," Lady Ashby told him. The Duke's face did something complicated. "I know," he said. "She told me first." Lady Ashby withdrew her hand from Georgiana's. She folded both hands in her lap, and she said, in a voice that was steady as iron, "Can you survive it?" The question was directed at Georgiana, and it was not about love. It was about everything else, the gossip, the cruelty, the whispered comments at balls, the turned backs, the women who would refuse to call on her, the men who would joke about the blind Duke's mute wife, the servants who would resent her, the newspapers that would speculate about her, the relentless, grinding daily work of existing in a world that had decided she did not belong. Georgiana did not hesitate. She held out her hand again, and when Lady Ashby took it, more slowly this time, she traced I-H-A-V-E-S-U-R-V-I-V-E-D-W-O-R-S-E. Lady Ashby read the letters. Her fingers tightened around Georgiana's, and then she did something that no one in the room expected, least of all herself. She laughed. It was a brief, sharp sound, the laugh of a woman who has been surprised by someone she underestimated, and it transformed her face entirely. For a moment she looked young. For a moment she looked like a woman who had not carried the weight of a dukedom on her shoulders for 20 years. "Yes," she said. "I imagine you have?" She stood. She crossed to her son. She took his face in her hands, a gesture of such sudden, fierce tenderness that Georgiana felt she was intruding simply by witnessing it, and said, "She'll do." The Duke exhaled. It was the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for longer than he knew. "Thank you, Mother." "Don't thank me. I haven't done anything yet." She released his face and turned back to Georgiana. "We have a great deal of work to do, Miss Lyle. The season is upon us, and if we are going to do this, we are going to do it properly. I will not have my son's choice whispered about in corners. It will be announced publicly, from a position of strength. Do you understand?" Georgiana nodded. Then, because she wanted Lady Ashby to feel what she meant, rather than simply see her agreement, she took the older woman's hand one more time and traced Yesyourgrace. Lady Ashby's mouth twitched. "You may call me mother," she said, "when we are alone. In public you will call me nothing, because you cannot call anyone anything, which I must say is rather convenient. Half the problems in this family have been caused by people saying things they shouldn't." And with that, the Dowager Duchess of Waverly swept from the room, already composing in her head the list of letters she would write, the calls she would make, the alliances she would activate, and the battle plan for the most audacious social maneuver London had seen in a decade. The campaign Lady Ashby mounted would have impressed Wellington. She began with the patronesses of Almack's. Not all of them. She was too strategic for that, but the two who owed her favours and the one who genuinely liked her. The first call was the most important. Lady Pemberton, who was both the most influential and the most sentimental of the patronesses, and who had known the late Duke of Waverly before his death. Lady Ashby arrived at Lady Pemberton's drawing-room at 3:30 on a Tuesday, dressed in her usual black, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. The pleasantries lasted exactly 4 minutes. Then Lady Ashby set down her teacup and said, "Emily, I need your help." Lady Pemberton raised an eyebrow. In 40 years of friendship, Lady Ashby had never asked for help. She had demanded it, negotiated for it, and occasionally commanded it, but never asked. "My son is going to marry a seamstress," Lady Ashby said. "She is mute. She cannot speak a single word. She is the daughter of a dead shopkeeper, and her mother lives in 2 rooms above a greengrocer's in Cheapside." She paused. "She is also the finest person I have ever met, and she has brought my son back from a place I was beginning to think was permanent." Lady Pemberton was quiet for a moment. "And Lady Hathaway is making difficulties." "Naturally." Lady Pemberton took a sip of tea. "What do you need?" "I need you to meet her. The girl. I need you to see what I saw, and then I need you to tell the 3 women whose opinions you most trust what you think." "And if I don't think well of her?" Lady Ashby met her eyes. "Then I will find another way, but I do not think that will be necessary." She placed the brown paper parcel on the table between them. Lady Pemberton unwrapped it. Inside was a handkerchief, white linen, exquisitely embroidered with a border of ivy leaves, so delicate they seemed to tremble. The stitching was invisible. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. "She made this," Lady Ashby said, "in a shop that pays her 12 shillings a week, by candlelight, with hands that have been working since she was 16 years old. She made this, and she put my son's initials in the corner in a stitch so fine you need a magnifying glass to see it." Lady Pemberton turned the handkerchief over, found the initials, examined the embroidery, and when she looked up, her expression had changed. It was not softness exactly. It was the look of a woman who recognized quality. In fabric, in character, in the kind of love that would drive a dowager duchess to a drawing-room with a parcel wrapped in brown paper and a request she had never made before. "Bring her to tea," Lady Pemberton said. "Thursday, 4 o'clock. I will have Lady Chelmsford and Lady Rotherham." "Thank you, Emily." "Don't thank me until Thursday is over." Thursday went well. It went better than well. Georgiana sat in Lady Pemberton's drawing-room and communicated through her notebook with a directness and composure that made 3 of the most powerful women in London forget, within 10 minutes, that she could not speak. She answered their questions without evasion. She did not grovel or perform gratitude, and when Lady Rotherham asked, with the bluntness for which she was famous, "What on earth does a seamstress want with a duke?" Georgiana wrote in her careful hand, "I don't want a duke. I want Theodore." The title came with him. Lady Pemberton read the note aloud. Lady Rotherham laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh, and said, "Well, that's the first honest answer anyone has given about a duke in this city since the conquest." By the time Georgiana left, she had 3 allies she didn't know she had. The patronesses would not publicly endorse the match. That was not how power worked at this level, but they would not oppose it. And in the particular calculus of London society, neutrality from the patronesses of Almack's was worth more than the enthusiastic support of anyone else. Next, Lady Ashby addressed the dress. Georgiana could not attend any public function in grey wool. Lady Ashby did not take her to a modiste. That would have been too obvious, too much like a makeover in a storybook, and Lady Ashby despised stories. Instead, she sent fabric to Georgiana. Silk, not ostentatious but fine, in colours that Georgiana herself would choose, and told her to make her own gowns. "You are a seamstress," she said through a note delivered by Grieve. "The best in London, according to my son, who has felt the work of every tailor on Jermyn Street and pronounces yours superior. You will dress yourself in your own work. It will be your armour and your calling card. When they ask who made your gown, and they will ask, you will write, 'I did.'" It was brilliant. It transformed Georgiana's trade from a liability into a distinction. She was not a common girl pretending to be a duchess. She was an artist who had caught a duke's attention through her craft. The narrative shifted from scandal to story. Georgiana made 3 gowns in 2 weeks. She worked until her fingers bled. Literally, the silk was unforgiving, and the designs she chose were ambitious, because if she was going to stand in a ballroom full of women who hated her, she was going to stand in something extraordinary. The first gown was deep blue, the colour of a winter sky just after sunset. The second was ivory, embroidered at the hem with a pattern of interlocking circles that, if you looked closely, resolved into a chain. An unbroken chain. Link after link, stitched so finely it looked like lacework. The third was burgundy, rich and dark, with a fitted bodice and sleeves that covered the scars on her arms while leaving her throat exposed. This last choice was deliberate. She would not hide. Not any more. The Duke felt each gown when it was finished. He ran his hands over the fabric, the seams, the embroidery, with the focused attention he brought to everything, reading the garments the way he read her, through texture and detail and the language of touch. "This one," he said, his fingers tracing the chain pattern on the ivory gown. "This one first." She tapped his palm. "Why?" "Because it tells them who you are without saying a word. Every link is connected, unbroken. You are telling them that you are complete, that you are not missing anything." He paused. His fingers lingered on the embroidery. "And because the stitching is so fine that every woman in the room will want to know who made it, and when they learn it was you, they will have to choose between their contempt for your station and their admiration for your skill. You are forcing them to see you as an artist, not an upstart." She stared at him. He was blind, and he had read her intention more accurately than anyone with sight could have. She traced on his palm, YOUSEEMORETHANANYONEIKNOW. "I don't see anything," he said. "I feel. There's a difference." But his mouth curved in that almost smile, and she catalogued it. Number 17, she thought, though she had lost count somewhere around 12, and stored it with all the others. The Ashby Ball was Lady Ashby's masterstroke. Every year, the Waverly family hosted a ball at their country estate. It had not been held for 3 years since the Duke's accident. Its revival would be news in itself, a signal that the Duke was returning to public life, that the Waverly name was not in decline, that the family remained a force. Lady Ashby announced it through the usual channels, cards sent to 300 families, the notice placed in the Morning Post. But she added a detail that transformed it from an event into an occasion. The invitation stated that the Duke of Waverly would be introducing his betrothed. London detonated. Every drawing room, every club, every coffee house erupted with speculation. Who was she? Was it the seamstress? Surely not. Surely even a blind duke would not. But Lady Ashby had said, and the invitations had been sent to everyone, which meant... Lady Hathaway received her invitation on a Tuesday morning. She read it twice. Then she sat down in her parlour and stared at the wall for a very long time. And the expression on her face was not anger. It was the flat, grey recognition of a woman who has overplayed her hand and knows it. She had two options: attend the ball and witness her defeat with dignity, or refuse the invitation and confirm to everyone who was watching that she was the bitter, scheming woman that Lady Ashby was about to expose her as. She chose to attend. It was, she calculated, the less destructive option. She was wrong about that, but she would not know it until later. Now, it's important to understand what a ball like this meant in the context of 1849 England, and specifically what it meant for the Waverly family to host it under these circumstances. The aristocratic ball was not merely a social event. It was a display of power. A duke who opened his house to 300 guests was demonstrating that his wealth was intact, his influence was active, and his family was united. Every detail, the food, the flowers, the music, the guest list, sent a message, and the message Lady Ashby intended was unmistakable. We are here. We are strong. Cross us at your peril. For Georgiana, the ball represented something even more significant. It was the moment she would step from the private world she shared with the Duke into the public one that had ignored her for 22 years. She would stand beside him in front of 300 people who had been told she was unsuitable, and she would do it without the ability to speak a single word in her own defense. Everything would depend on what they could communicate without speaking. The night of the ball arrived with the crystalline perfection of an English summer evening. The sky a pale luminous blue, the gardens of the Waverly country estate in full bloom, the house ablaze with more candles than Georgiana had ever seen in one place, hundreds of them, beeswax, not tallow, filling every room with warm golden light that turned the marble floors into pools of amber and the crystal chandeliers into galaxies of refracted flame. Georgiana had spent the previous week at the estate preparing. Lady Ashby had insisted on it, not because Georgiana needed to be coached, but because the Dowager Duchess understood that walking into a ballroom full of 300 people who have been gossiping about you for months is not something you do cold. You prepare, you armour yourself, you learn the terrain. And so for 7 days, Lady Ashby had walked Georgiana through the house. Every room, every corridor, every staircase. She had shown her where the retiring rooms were, where the refreshment tables would be, which corners offered privacy and which offered exposure. She had told her who would attend and what they would be thinking. She had introduced her to the head butler, the housekeeper, the footman who would attend the entrance, ensuring that every servant in the house knew who Georgiana was, treated her with the deference due to the Duke's intended, and understood that any word spoken against her below stairs would reach Lady Ashby's ears within the hour. Kitty Phelps had arrived 3 days before the ball, breathless and wide-eyed and utterly unintimidated by the grandeur of the Waverly estate, which she explored with the enthusiasm of a woman who had spent her life in a bookshop and had just been released into a world that exceeded even the novels she sold. "Georgie," Kitty said, standing in the centre of the great hall and turning in a slow circle, her red hair catching the light from the chandelier above. "There are more rooms in this house than there are books in my shop, and there are a lot of books in my shop." Georgiana smiled. She had been smiling more in recent weeks. Small, quiet smiles that most people would miss, but that Kitty, who had known her for 4 years and paid attention the way Georgiana paid attention, catalogued and cherished. It was Kitty who helped her dress on the night of the ball. Not the lady's maid Lady Ashby had provided, a competent woman named Prue, who was perfectly capable of the task. But Kitty, because some things require a friend, not a servant. Kitty laced the ivory gown. Kitty pinned her hair. Kitty fastened the pearls at her throat and stepped back and looked at her and said, in a voice that was not her usual cheerful tone, but something quieter and more fierce, "If anyone in that room makes you feel small tonight, you look at me. I'll be the red-haired disaster in the borrowed dress by the punch bowl, and I will make such a scene that they'll forget all about you." Georgiana took Kitty's hand and squeezed it. Twice. "That means yes, doesn't it?" Kitty said. "Lord, I'm learning Duke language." Then the music began. The carriages were arriving. The candles were lit. And Georgiana Lyle, seamstress, mute, nobody, stood at the top of the staircase and prepared to become visible. She dressed in the ivory gown. The chain pattern caught the light as she moved, each tiny link gleaming like a thread of gold. Her honey-coloured hair was pinned up, not in the elaborate styles that were fashionable, but in a simple, elegant arrangement that exposed the line of her neck and the scars. Her only jewellery was a single strand of pearls that the Duke had given her the previous week, pressing them into her hands with the words, "These belong to my grandmother. She would have liked you. She had no patience for nonsense either." She was terrified. Her hands, which were steady enough to set a seam invisible to the naked eye, were trembling. Her breath came in the short, shallow pattern that the Duke would have identified instantly as fear if he had been touching her. But he was not touching her. He was downstairs, waiting in the entrance hall, and she was standing at the top of the staircase, looking down at 300 faces that were all turned toward her, and the silence in the room was so absolute that she could hear the candles burning. It was Miss Kitty Phelps who saved her. Kitty, Georgiana's one friend, the shop girl from the bookseller's next door to Mrs. Holt's establishment, who had been invited to the ball by Lady Ashby specifically because Lady Ashby understood that a woman walking into battle needs at least one ally who is not family, appeared at her elbow. "Breathe," Kitty whispered. "Just breathe. You've survived worse than a room full of rich people, Georgie. These people can't even dress themselves without help." Georgiana almost laughed. The ghost of it moved through her throat, a vibration without sound, and it loosened something in her chest. She looked at Kitty, who was red-haired and freckled, and wearing a borrowed dress that didn't quite fit, and was grinning at her with the uncomplicated ferocity of genuine friendship. Then she looked down the staircase, and she saw him. He was standing at the bottom, dressed in black evening clothes that fit him with the precision she herself would have demanded, his dark hair sharp against the white of his cravat, his grey eyes open and directed upward, not at her because he could not see her, but toward her because he could feel her the way he felt everything, through the air itself. Grieve stood beside him. As Georgiana watched, Grieve leaned close and said something she could not hear, and the Duke's face, that guarded, controlled, beautiful face, did something she had never seen it do in company. It broke open, just for a moment, just long enough for her to see what was underneath all the armour and the authority and the cold precision. A man who was desperately, hopelessly, completely in love, and who was standing at the bottom of a staircase waiting for a woman he could not see, trusting her to come to him. She descended. The room watched. Every eye in the house tracked her movement down that staircase, the grey silk of the gown, the golden chain embroidery, the pearls at her throat, the scars she had not hidden. She moved with the careful grace of a woman who had spent her life being overlooked and was now, for the first time, choosing to be seen. At the bottom of the stairs, the Duke extended his hand, not in the formal way of an aristocrat greeting a partner. He simply held it out, palm up, the way he held it for her when they spoke, their language, their system, in front of everyone. She placed her hand in his. He closed his fingers around hers and brought her hand to his lips. Not the back of her hand. That was the formal gesture, the one that meant nothing. He turned her hand over and pressed his mouth to her palm, where she traced her words, where their entire world lived. The room made a sound. It was not a gasp exactly, and not a murmur. It was the collective intake of breath of 300 people witnessing something they had not expected to feel, and the sound of it rippled through the ballroom like wind through wheat. "You're trembling," the Duke said, low enough that only she could hear. She tapped his wrist twice. "Yes." "So am I," he said, "but they can't see it, and they can't see yours either. So as far as London is concerned, we are perfectly composed." She almost laughed again. The ghost of it vibrated through her hand and into his, and he felt it, and smiled. Not the almost smile, not the barely there flicker. A real smile, open, unguarded, in front of 300 people who had not seen the Duke of Waverly smile in 3 years. Lady Ashby appeared at their side with the timing of a woman who had orchestrated battles before. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, and her voice carried through the ballroom with the effortless projection of a woman who had been commanding rooms since before most of the guests were born. "My son, the Duke of Waverly, is delighted to welcome you to this evening's celebration, and it is my very great pleasure to introduce the woman who has brought light back into this house. Miss Georgiana Lyle, who has done my son the honour of accepting his proposal of marriage." And there it was, spoken aloud in front of everyone in Lady Ashby's voice of absolute authority, not a secret, not a shame, a celebration. The applause that followed was not universal. Georgiana could see the faces that did not clap, could see Lady Hathaway standing near the far wall in a gown of poisonous green, her expression perfectly controlled and her eyes murderous. Could see Lydia Hathaway beside her, looking not angry but confused, as though she had been told a story would end one way and it had ended another, and she was still trying to understand the twist. But the applause was majority. And it was genuine, because Lady Ashby had done her work well, and because the image before them, the blind Duke pressing his lips to his betrothed's palm, the golden chain glinting on her ivory gown, the quiet certainty of two people who had found each other in the dark, was more powerful than any gossip Lady Hathaway could produce. The ball continued. There was dancing, which Georgiana could not participate in, or so she thought, until the Duke took her hand and led her to the floor. "I can't," she traced on his palm. "You can," he said. "I'll lead. I know the steps. I memorized this room yesterday, every pillar, every table, every inch of floor, and you will guide me with your hand on my arm the way you always do. We'll move together the way we always do." It was madness. A blind man leading a mute woman in a waltz, in front of 300 witnesses. It should have been a disaster. It should have been awkward and pitiful, and the kind of spectacle that people whispered about for years. It was none of those things. What it was, what it became, was the most extraordinary dance anyone in that room had ever witnessed, because they were not relying on sight. They were not relying on the usual cues, the glances, the nods, the visible signals that dancing partners use to coordinate. They were relying on touch, on the pressure of her fingers on his arm, on the subtle shifts of his weight beneath her hand, on their language, the one they had built together, the one no one else could speak. Translated into movement, They moved in perfect synchrony, not because they were graceful, though they were, but because they were attuned to each other at a level that went deeper than grace. Every step was a conversation. Every turn was a sentence. Every time his hand tightened at her waist, it said, "I have you." Every time her fingers pressed his shoulder, it said, "I know." The orchestra played, the candles burned, and 300 people watched a blind duke and a mute seamstress speak to each other in a language that required neither sight nor sound, and the room was so silent, so absolutely, breathlessly silent, that you could hear the rustle of her ivory gown against the marble floor. When the dance ended, no one moved. No one spoke. The moment held, suspended, like a crystal in mid-air. Then someone began to clap. One person, then 2, then 10, then 100, and the sound swelled through the ballroom until it was not just applause, but something else. Something raw and honest, the sound of 300 people who had just witnessed the most authentic thing they had ever seen in a society built entirely on performance and pretense. Georgiana felt the vibration of it through the floor, through the Duke's hands, through her own bones. She had never heard applause directed at her. She could not hear it now, not the way others heard it, but she could feel it, and feeling was enough. It had always been enough. "I think," the Duke said, his mouth close to her ear, "that we just shocked the ton." She tapped his chest twice. Yes. The evening that followed the dance was a test, not of the kind that Lady Ashby had prepared for, but the subtler kind. The kind that happens when 300 people have just had their assumptions challenged and are trying to decide how they feel about it. Some decided immediately. The elderly Countess of Margate, who had known the Duke's grandmother and who still wielded considerable social authority from her bath chair by the fireplace, beckoned Georgiana over with a jewelled hand and spent 10 minutes examining the embroidery on her gown through a lorgnette, asking questions that Georgiana answered in her notebook. "You made this yourself," the Countess said. It was not a question. "This chain pattern, each link is individually stitched, by hand." She looked up from the gown to Georgiana's face, and her expression held none of the pity or curiosity that other guests wore. It held instead the particular respect of one craftsperson for another. "My late husband collected miniatures, paintings no larger than your palm, each one requiring months of work. He used to say that true skill was invisible. You had to know what to look for. This," she touched the embroidery with one papery finger, "this is invisible skill, the sort that most people walk past without noticing." "I notice." She then turned to the nearest cluster of ladies and said, in a voice calibrated to carry exactly as far as it needed to, "If any of you are still using Madame Fournier for your gowns, you are wasting your money." Others were less generous. Georgiana could see the whispers behind fans, the sidelong glances, the careful way certain women steered their daughters away from her as though muteness were contagious. She could see the men who looked at her with confusion, unable to categorize a woman who held a duke's heart and could not hold a conversation, and the men who looked at her with something worse than confusion, something speculative, as though her silence made her seem like a woman who might be easily managed or manipulated by someone cleverer than her husband. She was not easily managed. The men who attempted to speak to her discovered this quickly. One young lord, the kind of man who confused charm with entitlement, approached her near the refreshment table and began speaking to her in the slow, exaggerated tones that people reserved for the very young, the very old, and the very foreign. "You must be so pleased," he enunciated, "to be here at a real ball." Georgiana looked at him. She reached into the pocket of her gown, pulled out her notebook, and wrote a single sentence. "I can hear you perfectly well, my lord. It is only my voice that is absent, not my intelligence." The young lord read it. His face went scarlet. He retreated, and 3 women who had witnessed the exchange from nearby chairs stifled their laughter behind their fans and looked at Georgiana with something that was not quite acceptance, but was considerably warmer than what had been there before. Later in the evening she saw a face she had not expected. Mr. Oliver Stannard was standing near the terrace doors, a glass of champagne in his hand, looking not at all like the casual young law student who had visited her shop with invented excuses for tailoring. He was dressed well, better than she had seen him. And he was watching the room with the quiet, observational attention of a man who has come to understand something about himself. Their eyes met across the room. He did not approach. He did not presume. He simply raised his glass, a small private gesture, visible only to her, and the expression on his face was not longing or regret. It was recognition. He was looking at a woman in an ivory gown with chain-link embroidery, pearls at her throat, a duke's ring on her finger, and he was seeing, perhaps for the first time, not the mute seamstress he had been charmed by, but the full measure of who she was. Someone extraordinary. Someone who had been extraordinary all along in a shop on Barlow Street and whom he had liked without ever truly understanding. Georgiana inclined her head, a small nod. Thank you. For the kindness. For leaving when she asked. For not making it harder than it had to be. He nodded back. Then he turned to the terrace and walked out into the summer evening, and she did not see him again. He would marry a solicitor's daughter the following year, a woman with a quick laugh and strong opinions and a voice she used freely and often. And he would be happy, and he would sometimes tell his wife, late at night, about the mute seamstress who had taught him that the most interesting people in the world are often the ones who say the least. The Duke appeared at her side. He had felt her absence, the particular quality of air that changed when she moved away from him, and had crossed the room to find her with the unerring certainty that had stopped surprising her weeks ago. "You're standing near the terrace," he said. "I can feel the draught, and your heartbeat is slightly elevated." He paused. "Someone spoke to you?" She took his hand and tapped once. No, not spoke, not in any way that mattered. He accepted this. He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, and they stood together by the Auster terrace doors for a quiet moment, a breath between the evening's dramas, while the music played and the candles burned and 300 people swirled around them like a river around 2 stones that had found their place. There was supper, an elaborate affair of courses and silver, and the particular kind of orchestrated chaos that attended any event involving 300 people, and roasted pheasant. Georgiana was seated at the Duke's right hand, in the position of honour, and Lady Ashby was at the head of the table opposite, managing the conversation with the efficiency of a woman conducting a symphony. She guided topics toward Georgiana's skills, her needlework, her eye for design, her knowledge of textiles, and away from her silence, ensuring that the guests who sat near her came away impressed by what she could do, rather than fixated on what she could not. The Duke's hand found Georgiana's beneath the table. He squeezed it once, hard, and the squeeze said everything his face did not. Pride. Fierce, possessive, incandescent pride. It was during the supper that Kitty Phelps committed what would later be described as the most memorable social transgression of the evening. She had been seated, deliberately, by Lady Ashby, who understood the value of strategic placement between a duchess and a marchioness, neither of whom had any idea what to make of a red-haired bookseller's assistant in a borrowed dress. When the conversation turned, as conversations at aristocratic suppers inevitably did, to the question of who had designed Georgiana's extraordinary gown, Kitty said, in a voice that carried farther than she had intended, and farther than Lady Ashby would have preferred, "She made it herself in a room above a chandler's shop by candlelight, after working 12 hours in a dress shop that paid her 12 shillings a week. And it's better than anything any of you are wearing, and you know it." The silence that followed was atomic. Then the Countess of Margate, from her bath chair at the far end of the table, raised her glass and said, "Here, here," and the laughter that swept through the room, genuine, surprised, delighted laughter, was the sound of 300 people deciding collectively and irrevocably that perhaps the blind Duke's mute seamstress was not quite the scandal they had expected. Perhaps she was something more interesting than that. I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, but what about Lady Hathaway? We can't forget about her, can we? What happened to all those schemes, all that plotting? Keep listening. Lady Hathaway made her move at precisely 11 o'clock that evening, when the champagne had been flowing for 3 hours and the goodwill in the room was at its peak. She chose this moment deliberately, not because she thought she could win, but because she was a woman who had spent her life understanding the mechanics of social destruction, and she knew that even a lost cause could be made to wound. She approached Georgiana during a lull in the evening, when the Duke had been drawn aside by a parliamentary colleague, and Georgiana was standing near the refreshment table with Kitty Phelps, feeling both triumphant and exhausted, and wishing for the 1,000th time in her life that she could express either of those feelings out loud. "Miss Lyle," Lady Hathaway said. Her voice was pleasant. Her smile was perfect. Her eyes held the flat, reptilian calculation of a woman who has nothing left to lose. Georgiana turned. She inclined her head in acknowledgement. "I wanted to congratulate you," Lady Hathaway continued. "Truly. What a remarkable evening. A blind Duke and a mute seamstress. It's like something from a novel. The Tun does love a good story." She paused, delicately. "Of course, stories end. And when this one does, when the novelty has faded, when the season is over, and you're sitting alone in that enormous house with a man who cannot see you and no one to talk to, I wonder what you'll do then." Kitty Phelps opened her mouth to respond, but Georgiana placed a hand on her arm, a gentle pressure. "Wait." Lady Hathaway leaned closer. "He will tire of you," she said, and now the pleasantness was gone, and what was underneath was not cruelty, but conviction, the absolute certainty of a woman who believed in the rules of the world as she understood them. "He is a duke. You are a seamstress. This is not a fairy tale, Miss Lyle. This is England. And in England, men like him do not end up with women like you. They play with them for a season, and then they put them away." Georgiana stood very still. She felt the words land, felt them the way she felt everything, deeply and completely, in the place behind her ribs, where her voice should have been. And for a moment, just a moment, the old fear rose in her. The fear her mother had planted. The fear that she was nothing, that she was broken, that she was a girl the world had forgotten for good reason. Then the moment passed. She reached into the pocket of her gown, the small pocket she had sewn into every dress she made, the one that held her notebook and pencil, and she wrote, quickly, clearly in the handwriting that was as precise and controlled as her stitching. She tore out the page and held it up. Lady Hathaway read it. Her face went white. Kitty, reading over her shoulder, pressed her hand to her mouth. The note read, "He does not need to see me to know me. You have spent your whole life being seen, and no one has ever known you at all. I am sorry for your daughter. She deserved a mother, not a strategist." Lady Hathaway's hand shook. For a single, terrible second, something cracked in her expression. Something that was not anger or hatred, but recognition. The recognition of a truth spoken so plainly that there was no defense against it. Then she gathered herself. She folded the note. She put it in her reticule. And she walked away. She left the ball an hour later with Lydia, who had danced twice and spoken to no one of consequence, and would in time marry a perfectly respectable clergyman in Hampshire and live a perfectly respectable life, and never once wonder what might have been. Because Lydia Hathaway was not a woman who wasted time on wondering. Lady Hathaway would attend no more events that season. She would retire to her house in Belgravia and tend to her diminishing social garden, and the Ton would gradually, painlessly forget her. It was not a spectacular downfall. It was not the kind of dramatic public destruction that makes audiences cheer. But it was, in its way, the most devastating kind of defeat. The kind that comes not from being attacked, but from being seen clearly by someone you underestimated. Georgiana had not destroyed Lady Hathaway. She had simply held up a mirror, and what Lady Hathaway saw in it was the truth about herself. Some battles are won with armies. Others are won with a single, honest sentence. The days after the ball were strange and golden. Society had not fully accepted Georgiana. That would take time, possibly years, possibly never. But it had absorbed the shock, and the consensus that was forming was, if not enthusiastic, at least curious. The seamstress had skill. The Duke was clearly besotted. The Dowager Duchess was clearly in command. And the love story, however improbable, was undeniably compelling. Invitations arrived at Grosvenor Square. Not many, not the flood that would greet a conventional ducal engagement, but enough. Lady Ashby selected the ones worth accepting with surgical precision, choosing events where Georgiana would be seen to advantage and declining those where she would be vulnerable. And through it all, the Duke and Georgiana continued to refine their language. It had expanded beyond touch now. She had begun teaching him to read her facial expressions through his improving vision, which he had still not told her about. And he had begun teaching her to use the vibrations of sound in ways she had never considered. He would press her hand to a piano while he played, letting her feel the music through the wood and wire. He would stand behind her at open windows and describe what he could not see, the sounds of the street, the rhythm of carriages, the distant bell of a church, building for her a picture of the world made entirely of things that were not visual. They were, without realizing it, creating something that the world had never seen before, a mode of communication that did not rely on any single sense, but combined all of them into something richer and more complex than language itself. It was during one of these evenings, a quiet one, just the two of them in the study, the fire burning low, that the Duke told her about his vision. He took her hand. He held it for a long time before he spoke. "I have to tell you something," he said. "Something I should have told you weeks ago. I was afraid. And I am not a man who is often afraid." She waited. Her fingers were still in his palm. She could feel his pulse, rapid, irregular, betraying the calm of his voice. "My sight is returning," he said, slowly. "The Edinburgh physician said this might happen, that the bruising in my brain might heal with time. I can see shapes now, movement, light and dark. He cannot say whether it will continue to improve or stop where it is." He paused. "Georgiana, I can almost see you." She did not move. Her hand did not tighten or pull away. She simply sat with the information, the way she sat with all information, patiently, completely, letting it settle before she responded. Then she traced on his palm, AREYOUAFRAID. "Yes," he said immediately, "not of seeing, of losing what we have, our language, the way we communicate. If I can see, I won't need to feel your words on my palm. I won't need to read your heartbeat through." Your fingers! I won't need—" His voice broke. "I built my entire world around your touch. If I can see, I'm afraid the touch will mean less." She took both his hands. She pressed them to her throat the way she had that day in the study. The day everything changed, and she shaped a word with her ruined voice. A word he could feel but not hear, a word that vibrated against his fingertips with all the force of a woman who had spent 11 years being silent and was now saying the only thing that mattered. Stay. He felt it. She knew he felt it because his hands trembled against her throat and his breath caught, and his grey eyes, those beautiful, useless, almost seeing eyes, filled with tears that he could not blink away. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. His voice was wrecked. "I'm not going anywhere, Georgiana. Even if I see the whole world clearly, I will still close my eyes and put my hands on your skin and read you the way I've always read you, because seeing you was never the point. Knowing you was the point. And I know you better than I know my own name." She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. They stayed like that. Foreheads touching, breath mingling, hands clasped between them. Two people who had found each other in the dark, and who knew, with the bone-deep certainty that comes from surviving, that the light would not change what they had built. It would only make it visible. The wedding took place in September. The weeks leading up to it were a strange mixture of tenderness and logistics. Lady Ashby managed the latter with military precision. The church, the flowers, the guest list, the solicitor, the settlements, the trousseau, which Georgiana made herself, every stitch, because some things you do not delegate. The Duke managed the former, though managed was perhaps too controlled a word for what was happening between them. They had grown bolder, not reckless, never reckless. Both of them understood too well the consequences of carelessness, but bolder in the way that two people grow when the decision has been made and the future has been claimed. He held her hand in front of the servants now. He spoke about her to visitors, the few he received, without hesitation. He had begun, tentatively, to learn the hand sign alphabet from the same kind of book that Anne Lyle would later discover, supplementing their private language with a system that others could potentially learn. "I want people to be able to talk to you," he said one evening, practicing the signs with the focused determination he brought to everything. "Not just me. I don't want to be the only door between you and the world. You deserve more doors." She had traced on his palm YOUARENOTADOOR, YOUARETHEWHOLEHOUSE. He had laughed at that, a real laugh, unexpected and full, the kind that transformed his face from something austere and guarded into something open and young and almost boyish. She counted it. The first real laugh. She would hear many more, but this one she kept separately, in the part of her memory where she stored the things that mattered most. There were also difficult conversations about children. Could she bear them safely, given the scarring? The doctor said yes, but the question required asking. About her mother. Would Anne Lyle be invited to the wedding? Georgiana wrote the invitation. They waited. No reply came. About his sight. What if it deteriorated again? What if the improvements reversed? He asked her this late one night, sitting in the study, his voice stripped of everything except fear. She had taken his face in her hands. She had traced on his cheek THENWEWEAREBEWEWEANDWEWERENOUGH. He had pressed his lips to her palm and held them there, and neither of them had needed to say anything else. The wedding itself was held at the Waverly Estate Chapel. A small ancient building with stained glass windows that cast coloured light across the stone floor like scattered jewels. The guest list was smaller than London expected, 150, carefully chosen, each one vetted by Lady Ashby and approved by the Duke. The people who had been kind were invited. The people who had been cruel were not. There was no ambiguity about which was which. Georgiana wore a gown she had made herself, white silk embroidered with the chain pattern that had become her signature, each link worked in silver thread so fine it was almost invisible. At the hem she had stitched something new, tiny letters, hidden among the links, spelling out words in the touch language she and the Duke had created. Only he would ever find them. Only he would ever read them. They were a private conversation woven into her wedding dress, a love letter that required no voice and no sight, only the patient attention of fingertips against silk. Now I want to explain something about marriage in this era, because it matters, and because Georgiana's situation raised a legal question that most people never had to consider. In 1849, England, marriage required the expressed consent of both parties. The key word is expressed, not spoken. English ecclesiastical law, which governed marriage, had long recognized that a person who could not speak could still consent, provided that consent was made clearly and unmistakably through other means: a nod, a written statement, a sign. This was not new. There were recorded cases going back centuries of marriages performed with mute brides or grooms, and the law was settled on the point. A nod given in the presence of witnesses when the question had been clearly put constituted valid consent. But settled law and social acceptance are very different things. A mute woman marrying a duke attracted scrutiny that a typical marriage would not. There would be people, Lady Hathaways, allies, distant relatives with an eye on the Waverly fortune, anyone who wanted to challenge the match, who might argue that Georgiana had not truly understood the vows, or that her consent had been coerced, or that a woman who could not speak her own name was not competent to enter a binding contract. This was why Lady Ashby had arranged for a solicitor to be present, not because the law required it, but because the family's enemies might try to exploit any procedural gap. When the clergyman read the vows and Georgiana indicated her consent through a clear, deliberate nod, witnessed by the solicitor, by Grieve, by 150 guests, and by a dowager duchess who had left nothing to chance, she was not merely agreeing to a marriage. She was asserting, in the only language available to her, that a woman without a voice still had the right to choose her own life. Under the laws of coverture, which governed English marriage until the Married Women's Property Act, began to chip away at them later in the century, a woman who married ceased to exist as a separate legal person. Her property became her husband's. Her earnings became his. Her very identity was subsumed into his. For most women, this was a surrender of autonomy. For Georgiana, it was the opposite. She had no property to lose. She had no legal voice that marriage could silence. Silence was already her permanent condition. What she gained was protection, status, and the one thing she had never had, a place in the world that could not be taken from her. As the Duchess of Waverly, she would have a home, a title, and a husband whose power would shield her from every cruelty that had ever touched her life. It was not a fairy tale. It was practical. It was strategic. And it was also entirely and overwhelmingly love. The Duke stood at the altar and waited for her. He was dressed in grey, not black, which was his habit, but grey, the colour of his eyes, the colour of the dresses Georgiana had worn when she first came to him. He had chosen it deliberately, and when Grieve had asked why, he had said simply, because that was the colour of the world when she entered it. His vision had continued to improve. He could see more now. Not clearly, not with any precision, but enough to perceive shapes and colours and the general architecture of a room. He could see, when Georgiana appeared at the far end of the chapel, a figure in white moving toward him through columns of coloured light. He could not see her face. He could not see the expression she wore, or the tears she was not crying, or the way her hands, hidden in her bouquet, were trembling. But he could see her. She reached the altar. She placed her hand in his, and he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear, "I can see you." She tapped his palm twice. She was smiling. He could not see the smile, but he could feel it. The change in her hand, the loosening of tension, the particular quality of a body that is radiating joy. "You're beautiful," he said. "I can't see the details, but I can see the shape of you and the light on you and the way you're standing, and Georgiana, you are the most beautiful thing in my world. You always will be." She pressed her fingers to his lips. She shaped a word against them. He felt it. Yes. The ceremony was brief and perfect. When the clergyman asked if she would take this man, she nodded, the clear, deliberate, witnessed nod that made it irrevocable. And the room exhaled. When it was done, the Duke kissed her. Not gently, not tentatively. He kissed her the way a man kisses a woman he has wanted since the first moment he felt her heartbeat under his fingertips, completely, urgently, with 300 years of Ashby composure crumbling like sand. The congregation applauded. Kitty Phelps wept openly. Lady Ashby did not weep because she was Lady Ashby, but her chin trembled once, and Grieve, who was the only person positioned to see it, recorded the moment in his memory, and would never mention it to anyone. And her mother, Anne Lyle, was not at the wedding. She had been invited. Georgiana had written the invitation herself in her careful hand and sent it by Grieve. But she had not replied. She had not come. This was the wound that Georgiana carried into her new life, the one wound that all the Duke's wealth and power and love could not heal. Because he could protect her from Lady Hathaway. He could shield her from the Tun. He could give her a title and a home and a language that was theirs alone. But he could not make her mother love her. No one could do that. That was the one thing that was beyond the reach of even the most powerful duke in England. But something happened. Something small, something quiet, something that Georgiana would not learn about until months later. One week after the wedding, Anne Lyle walked into a bookshop on the Strand. She was not a reader. Had never been. But something had drawn her there, some impulse she could not name. She browsed the shelves for 20 minutes without purpose. And then she found, on a table near the back, a small volume titled A Method of Communication for the Deaf and Mute, published for the benefit of those who cannot speak. She bought it. She took it home. And in the following weeks, she began to learn, slowly, clumsily, with the stiff fingers of a woman who had never been patient with anything, the hand sign alphabet that the book described. Not the Duke's language, not the private system of taps and traces that Georgiana and Theodore had built together, but something, a beginning. A way to say what she had never been able to say aloud because the words had always stuck in her throat, the way Georgiana's voice stuck in hers, not from damage, but from shame. She wrote to her daughter 2 months after the wedding. The letter was short. "I am learning to speak to you. It is difficult. I should have started years ago. I am sorry for many things. I am trying." Georgiana read the letter in the Duke's study. Their study now filled with light because the curtains were open at last. She read it twice. Then she pressed it to her heart and closed her eyes. And the tears that came were not the tears of the girl who had stood in the entrance hall and absorbed her mother's cruelty in silence. They were the tears of a woman who had survived. The Duke and Duchess of Waverly became, in time, one of the most celebrated couples in London. Not for their wealth, though their wealth was considerable, and not for their titles, though their titles were ancient, but for the thing that no one could explain and everyone could feel, the way they communicated. The way he turned toward her when she entered a room, guided by some sense that went beyond the five that other people relied on. The way she placed her hand on his arm and entire conversations happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The way they danced, always together, always in their own private rhythm, always in perfect synchrony. Their daily life settled into rhythms that were as particular and distinctive as their language itself. Mornings began with Georgiana tracing "Good morning" on his palm before either of them had fully woken. A ritual that had started the first morning of their marriage and that neither of them would ever break. Not in illness, not in travel, not even on the morning their first child was born and Georgiana was exhausted and radiant and shaking with the overwhelm of what her body had just accomplished. Her hand found his palm. The letters formed. "Good morning," he read to her in the evenings. Or rather, Grieve read aloud while the Duke and Georgiana sat together, her hand resting on his arm, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand that were not quite words and not quite random, but something in between, an unconscious commentary on whatever they were hearing. When the reading pleased him, the pattern was slow and circular. When it bored him, it was short and staccato. Georgiana could have narrated his opinions without Grieve ever stopping to ask. She continued to sew. Lady Ashby had been right about the gowns. Within a year, 3 of the most fashionable women in London had approached Georgiana privately to commission dresses, drawn not by pity or curiosity, but by genuine admiration for her work. She declined to open a shop. She was a duchess now, and duchesses did not operate shops. But she took commissions, selectively, on her own terms, at prices that reflected her skill rather than her need. And the income went into a fund that she managed herself, because the Married Women's Property Act was still years away and she had no legal right to her own earnings. But the Duke had signed a private agreement placing the money in a trust for her use alone. "It's your money," he said, when she had tried to protest. "You earned it. I will not be the kind of husband who takes what his wife has built." This was unusual. This was, in fact, almost unheard of. In 1850, a married woman's earnings belonged to her husband as surely as her person did. The Duke's private agreement had no legal force. Any court in England would have ruled the money his. But it had moral force. It had the force of a man who understood what it meant to have your autonomy stripped away by circumstances beyond your control, and who refused to do the same to the woman he loved. The household at Grosvenor Square transformed. The curtains, which had been drawn for 3 years, were open now. Permanently, irrevocably open, letting London's grey light flood rooms that had been dark since the accident. The furniture was rearranged again, but differently this time, not stripped and pushed aside to prevent a blind man from stumbling, but placed with intention, with beauty, with Georgiana's eye for proportion and the Duke's sensitivity to texture and warmth. Together they created a home that worked for both of them. A home where the candles burned because Georgiana loved the way they smelled, even though the Duke couldn't see them. A home where the piano was always in tune because the Duke loved to play, and Georgiana loved to rest her hands on the instrument's body and feel the vibrations of the music travelling through the wood and into her bones. A home where silence was not absence but presence, the particular, full, breathing silence of 2 people who were communicating all the time, in every moment, through every sense except the 2 they had lost. The reconciliation with Anne Lyle happened slowly. The letter Georgiana had read in the study. "I am learning to speak to you. It is difficult. I should have started years ago. I am sorry for many things. I am trying. And was only the beginning. Georgiana had written back. A long letter, longer than anything she had ever written, because the notebook she had carried for 11 years dealt in necessities and courtesies, not in feelings. She wrote about the fire. She wrote about the years of silence. She wrote about the way it felt to be looked at by your own mother and see not love, but blame. She wrote all of it, every hurt, every wound, every moment of loneliness, and she did it not as an accusation, but as an offering. Here, this is what it was. This is what it cost. I am telling you because you asked, and because no one has ever asked before. Anne Lyle received the letter on a Thursday. She read it at her kitchen table in Cheapside. She read it 3 times, and then she went to the small wooden box beneath her bed where she kept the things she had saved from the wreckage, and she took out a lock of Georgiana's hair, baby hair from when Georgiana was 3 years old. Honey-coloured, fine, tied with a thread. She held it in her palm and she stared at it, and the weight of 11 years of wasted time settled on her shoulders like a physical thing. She wrote back, a shorter letter, because Anne Lyle had never been good with words, and the irony of this, that both mother and daughter were women who could not say what they needed to say, was not lost on her. I was angry at God, and I took it out on you. That is the truth. I cannot undo it, but I am learning the alphabet from the book. My fingers are stiff, but they are learning. If you will have me, I would like to try. Christmas came. Georgiana invited her mother to the Waverly estate. Anne Lyle arrived on Christmas Eve in her mended coat and her worn shoes, and stood in the entrance hall staring at the marble and the candles and the impossible wealth of a world she had never imagined her daughter would inhabit. The Duke met her. He extended his hand. Mrs. Lyle, welcome to our home. Anne Lyle took his hand. She looked up at this tall, dark, unseeing man who had married her mute daughter, and whatever she had expected to feel in his presence, it was not what she actually felt, which was recognition. He was damaged, like Georgiana, like herself. She got that from her father, Anne Lyle said. The quiet attention, the way she watches. He used to do that, sit in the shop and watch the customers like he was reading them. It was the first kind thing she had said about Georgiana, about the part of Georgiana that was specifically, uniquely her, in 11 years. The reunion happened in the drawing room where the fire was lit and the candles burned. Anne Lyle stood in the doorway. Georgiana stood by the window. They looked at each other across 12 feet of carpet that might as well have been 12 years of silence. Then Anne Lyle raised her hands, stiff, clumsy, trembling. She signed 3 words. They were wrong. The shapes were imprecise, the movements uncertain, but the meaning was clear. I love you. Georgiana crossed the room in 4 steps and wrapped her arms around her mother. And Anne Lyle, who had not hugged her daughter since the night of the fire, folded into the embrace like a woman who had been standing for too long and had finally been told she could sit down. Later that evening, Anne Lyle sat in the nursery with her granddaughter, 3 months old, brown-eyed and dark-haired, and possessed of a voice that worked perfectly and was exercised at considerable volume. And she signed clumsy words with her stiff fingers while the baby laughed and reached for her hands. The Duke found Georgiana in the corridor outside the nursery. She was watching through the open door, her hand pressed to the scars on her throat, her eyes bright. He stood beside her. He could hear it. The baby's laugh, the grandmother's murmured words, the particular quality of a room where something broken was being mended. "Is that enough?" he asked quietly. 2 taps against his arm. Yes. It was enough. Not perfection, not the erasure of 11 years of hurt, but effort, sustained, clumsy, imperfect effort, which was the only kind of love that means anything, not the love that comes easily, but the love that comes hard. Anne Lyle came back at Easter and at midsummer, and by the following Christmas her signs were better. Still imperfect, still bearing the particular character of a woman who had come to language late, but recognizable and intentional and delivered with a consistency that was its own form of devotion. She never fully stopped being difficult. She was Anne Lyle. But the cruelty stopped. The blame stopped. And in their place, slowly, painfully, like a plant growing through stone, something else emerged. A new relationship, different from the one they should have had, scarred, like both of them, but alive. Their language evolved as his vision improved. By the time a year had passed, he could see her face. Not perfectly, not with the clarity that others took for granted, but well enough to recognize her. Expression, her smile, the way her brown eyes held steady and warm on his when he spoke. But they never abandoned the touch. Every morning she traced good morning on his palm. Every night he pressed his lips to the hollow of her throat where her scars were, where her voice would have been, and whispered good night against the skin that had once been a source of shame, and was now, to him, the most sacred geography in the world. The first time he saw her face clearly, truly clearly, with enough definition to distinguish her features, he wept. She was sitting by the window of the study, reading, the afternoon light falling across her in that particular golden way that English light falls in late summer. He had been watching her for 10 minutes, watching the blur of her resolve into something more defined, like a painting coming into focus, when suddenly the shapes coalesced and he saw her. Not perfectly. The edges were still soft, but he saw her brown eyes. He saw the honey color of her hair. He saw the scars on her throat, silvery and delicate, like the trail of a finger drawn through frost. And he understood with a force that nearly stopped his heart that he had been right all along. She was beautiful, not in the way that London understood beauty, in a way that only a man who had spent years in darkness and had learned to see with his hands and his heart could understand. She was beautiful the way a well-made seam is beautiful, precise, intentional, strong where it needs to be strong. She was beautiful the way silence is beautiful when it is not absence but presence. She was beautiful the way the first light is beautiful after a long, long night. "Georgiana," he said. His voice was not steady. She looked up. He saw the movement, the lift of her chin, the turn of her head, the way her eyes found his. "I can see you," he said. She crossed the room. She stood before him, and he raised his hand and traced the shape of her face. Not with his fingertips, as he had done 100 times before, but with his eyes. "You're crying," she traced on his palm. "I know," he said. "I can see that too." She reached up and touched his tears, and he saw it, saw her hand rising, saw her fingers reaching for him, saw the tenderness in the gesture that he had always felt but never witnessed. "This is what love looks like when I can see it," he said. She smiled, and he saw it. For the first time, he saw Georgiana Lyle smile, the small, quiet, devastating smile that he had felt against his fingertips and his lips and his chest 1,000 times before, and the sight of it was, he would later tell Grieve, the single most beautiful thing he had ever seen or would ever see in whatever remained of his life. The ton adjusted. The ton always adjusts. Within 2 seasons, the Duchess of Waverly was not merely accepted but admired. Her gowns were copied by every modiste in London. Her quiet composure was praised as elegance, rather than limitation, and her story was told and retold in drawing-rooms across England until it had the polished, inevitable quality of a fairy tale. But it was not a fairy tale. Fairy tales end with the wedding. Georgiana and Theodore's story continued. Through the birth of their daughter, through the reconciliation with Anne Lyle, through the ordinary, extraordinary days of a marriage built on the most honest communication either of them had ever known. The Duke's vision stabilized at moderate impairment, enough to navigate the world, not enough to read or recognize faces at a distance. He would never see clearly again. He did not mind. He had spent 3 years in total darkness, and the grey, blurred, imperfect world he now inhabited was more than he had ever expected to have again. And besides, the most important things in his life, Georgiana's heartbeat, the weight of his daughter in his arms, the warmth of a fire in the grate, the rustle of silk against marble, had never required sight. Georgiana never spoke, not a single word, not in all the years that followed. Her voice was gone, and it would not return, and she had made her peace with that loss years before she ever met the Duke. But she communicated, constantly, fluently, in the language they had built and continued to build every day of their lives. And anyone who spent 5 minutes in their company understood that silence and voicelessness were not the same thing. She had never been voiceless. She had simply been waiting for someone who could hear her. Years later, many years later, when their daughter was grown and their hair was grey, and the touch language they had created had been adopted in simplified form by 2 schools for the deaf in London, Georgiana sat in the study at Grosvenor Square and sewed. Not because she needed to, not because anyone was paying her. She sewed because her hands knew nothing else, and because the rhythm of needle through fabric was as essential to her as breathing. The Duke sat across from her. He was reading. Or rather, Grieve was reading aloud from the afternoon paper, while the Duke sat with his eyes half closed and his hand resting on the arm of the chair. His vision had stabilized years ago. He could see her clearly enough now. The way the afternoon light caught the grey in her honey-coloured hair, the way her fingers moved with the automatic precision of decades of practice, the way her face settled into that particular expression of absorbed concentration that he had felt 1,000 times before he ever saw it. Grieve finished the article and withdrew, with the silent efficiency of a man who had spent a lifetime knowing when his presence was needed and when it was not. The Duke watched his wife sew. "Georgiana," he said. She looked up, her brown eyes, steady, warm, patient, the eyes that had watched the world for 40 years and had never stopped paying attention, found his. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Something I've been thinking about for a long time." She set down her needle. She waited. She was still the most patient person he had ever known. "When I lost my sight," he said, "I thought the world had ended. I sat in this room for 3 years, and I mourned the loss of everything I could no longer see. Colours, faces, sunsets, the expression on a woman's face when she's lying about being happy. I thought sight was the most important sense. I thought that without it nothing else could matter." He paused. His hand found hers across the space between their chairs. An automatic gesture, as natural as breathing. The muscle memory of 20 years of reaching for her. "I was wrong," he said. "The most important sense is not sight. It's attention, the willingness to notice, the patience to feel what someone else is feeling without needing them to perform it for you. You taught me that. You, a woman who couldn't speak a word, who communicated. Everything through touch and presence and the absolute, unwavering quality of your attention taught me that the world is richer when you pay attention to it, not with your eyes, with everything." She traced on his palm, the way she had 10,000 times before, the way she would trace 10,000 times more. I-L-O-V-E-Y-O-U. He smiled, the real smile, the one she had counted and catalogued and carried with her since the first time she saw it, in a darkened study on a grey afternoon, when a blind duke and a mute seamstress had discovered that the walls between them were not walls at all, but doors. "I know," he said. "I've always known, from the very first moment you put your hand in mine." And in the study at Grosvenor Square, where the curtains were open and the piano was in tune and the candles burned with the steady golden light that she loved, two people sat together in a silence that was not silence at all, but a conversation, continuous, complex, and more eloquent than any words either of them could have spoken. Can I just say, this story is why I do this. The idea that two people can find each other at the exact intersection of their deepest wounds and build something there, not despite those wounds, but because of them. That's not fantasy. That's the truest thing I know about love. I poured a lot of myself into this story, and I hope you felt that. If it resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Tell me your favorite moment. Tell me what hit you the hardest. And if you want to support this channel, subscribing is the best way to do it. Every subscribe, every comment, every share, it all helps this community grow. And this community is something special. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Thank you for being the kind of person who gives 2 hours of their life to a story about two people learning to speak without words. That tells me something about you. And I like what it tells me. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves.